They took everything from him: his reputation, his career, the future he had bled to build, and the woman who signed the order that ended it all. She never looked back. Until the day she needed him most. 15 years is a long time to carry someone's name like a wound you refuse to examine. 15 years of billion-dollar contracts, global expansion, magazine covers, and boardroom victories. And still, somewhere deep beneath all of it, the memory of a man's face the moment his world collapsed. A face that didn't scream, didn't threaten, just went quiet in a way that was somehow worse than rage. If you've ever watched someone lose everything they earned through no fault of their own, stay with me. Because this story doesn't start where you think it does. Hit like, drop your city in the comments, and let's see how far this story travels. The morning they destroyed Ethan Walker's life, the coffee in the executive break room on the 43rd floor was still hot. That detail stayed with him for years afterward. The absurdity of it. Hot coffee, pastries arranged in a neat spiral on a silver tray, floor-to-ceiling windows catching the early October light over Seattle's skyline, painting the whole room in gold. Everything so perfectly ordinary, so aggressively normal, while the meeting down the hall dismantled a man's entire professional existence piece by piece. Ethan had been running on 3 hours of sleep when he arrived at Langford Aviation's headquarters that morning. His daughter Lily was 4 years old and had spent most of the previous night fighting a fever that peaked at 103 degrees before finally breaking around 2 in the morning. He'd sat on the edge of her bed with a damp cloth and a copy of The Velveteen Rabbit that she'd asked him to read 3 times in a row, her small hand curled around 2 of his fingers, even as she finally drifted off. He hadn't slept after that. He'd just sat there in the dark of her room, listening to her breathe, and thought about the presentation he had to give in 7 hours. Project Meridian. 18 months of work. 18 months of early mornings and missed dinners and weekends surrendered to code and calculations and system architecture that, if it worked the way Ethan knew it would fundamentally change how aviation networks managed real-time weather rerouting across international airspace. It wasn't just a project. It was the kind of work that came along once in a career, maybe once in a lifetime. The kind of thing you built knowing it would outlast you. He'd driven to the office with the windows down despite the cold, needing the air to stay sharp. Lily's drawings were taped to the passenger visor. 3 crayon airplanes that listed drunkenly to the left, the way her drawings always did, because she pressed harder with her right hand than her left. He'd looked at them at every red light on the drive-in, a small ritual he couldn't have explained to anyone. The 43rd floor was already buzzing when he arrived. That should have been his first signal that something was wrong. Project Meridian's preliminary review wasn't scheduled until 9. It was 7:42. Senior engineers didn't show up an hour early to preliminary reviews unless there was a reason that nobody wanted to be the one to explain. Marcus Hale was standing near the window with a coffee cup he wasn't drinking from when Ethan walked into the main corridor. Marcus was Ethan's direct supervisor, a compact, carefully groomed man in his late 40s who had a talent for making you feel like you were always slightly behind on something important. He had never liked Ethan, specifically because Ethan was exactly the kind of engineer who made supervisors feel unnecessary. But Marcus had always been professional about it, managed to package his dislike in the language of mentorship and constructive feedback. That morning, he didn't even bother with the packaging. Walker. He said the name like it was a problem he'd been handed. "You're here." "I've got the 9 o'clock, Ethan said, shifting the laptop bag on his shoulder. "Came in early to run through the final sequence again before the review." Marcus glanced toward the far end of the corridor, toward the conference room with the glass walls. 3 people were already seated inside. Ethan recognized 2 of them, Gerald Royce, the company's chief operations officer, and Sandra Chen from legal. The third was a woman he'd never seen before, young and sharply dressed, leaning over a stack of printed reports with a pen in her hand. "There's been a development," Marcus said. Ethan looked at him. "What kind of development?" Marcus set his coffee cup down on the nearest windowsill and crossed his arms. "The kind you're going to need to be very calm about." That was the first moment, the first genuine crack of unease. Because Marcus Hale telling someone to stay calm was roughly equivalent to a pilot telling passengers to remain seated after a sound no plane should make. It meant calm was the last thing the situation warranted. "Marcus, what happened?" The overnight diagnostic runs on the Meridian system, Marcus said. The automated audit caught anomalies in the core stability algorithm, significant ones, the kind that would have caused a catastrophic failure on deployment. Ethan went very still. That's not possible. The report says otherwise. Then the report is wrong. He said it flatly, not defensively, as a statement of engineering fact. I ran that diagnostic myself 2 days ago. There were no anomalies. The stability algorithm is clean. I rebuilt it from scratch after the February integration issue. I can show you the logs. The logs, Marcus said, and something in the way he said it made Ethan's stomach drop, are part of what's being questioned. The conference room meeting lasted 40 minutes. Ethan was not invited to attend. He sat in the waiting area outside the glass walls and watched the 3 people inside pass documents back and forth and speak in the low, deliberate tones of people making a decision they had already made. Twice, Sandra Chen from legal looked up and met his eyes through the glass, and both times she looked away first in a way that told him everything he needed to know about what kind of meeting this was. He called his daughter's babysitter from the corridor, kept his voice level, asked if she could stay an extra few hours. The babysitter said, of course, no problem, heard something in his voice that made her not ask questions. He thanked her and hung up and stared at his phone's lock screen for a long moment. Lily, at last year's Halloween, dressed as a bumblebee, laughing at something off camera, laughing the way kids laugh when they haven't yet learned to hold anything back. He put the phone in his pocket and sat up straight and waited. At 8:47, a young assistant he didn't recognize appeared at the door and told him that Ms. Langford would see him now. He hadn't known Victoria Langford would be in the building. In his experience, the CEO of a $3 billion aviation company didn't typically appear in person for a preliminary technical review. The fact that she was here, the fact that she had been summoned or had summoned herself, told him that whatever this was, it had already been escalated to a level that made his stomach feel like cold concrete. He'd seen Victoria Langford in person only twice before. Once at a company-wide town hall 18 months ago, where she'd stood at the front of a full auditorium and spoken for 40 minutes without notes about the future of sustainable aviation with the kind of focused energy that made you forget she was 30 years old. The second time in an elevator, a brief 30-second ride in which she'd been reading something on her phone and barely looked up, though she'd said "good morning" in a tone that suggested she actually meant it. She was nothing like what people expected from the daughter of the man who'd built Langford Aviation into what it was. Richard Langford had been old money, old school, old industry, the kind of executive who believed competence was inherited and women in aviation belonged in the cabin, not the cockpit. His daughter had spent the first 5 years after inheriting his company systematically dismantling every structure he'd built and replacing it with something leaner, more aggressive, and significantly more profitable. People in the industry had underestimated her exactly once. Nobody made that mistake twice. She was standing when Ethan entered the conference room, and she did not sit down, which told him she didn't intend for this to take long. Mr. Walker, her voice was controlled, professional, the voice of someone who had already processed this situation and was now in the portion of the process that involved clean outcomes. Thank you for coming in. I've been sitting outside for 40 minutes, Ethan said. A brief pause. If the directness bothered her, she absorbed it without visible reaction. I understand this is difficult, she said. Ms. Langford. He set his laptop bag down on the conference table, not aggressively, just firmly, establishing that he intended to have a full conversation. Before whatever you're about to say, I need you to know that I've already reviewed the anomaly report, and the findings don't match anything in the actual codebase. Someone altered the diagnostic logs. The stability algorithm I submitted was clean. I can prove that if you give me 20 minutes and access to the backup server. She glanced at Sandra Chen. Something passed between them, the kind of glance that had the weight of a previous conversation behind it. We've reviewed the backup server records, Sandra said carefully. Then you reviewed the wrong version, Ethan said. The timestamps on those records, if you look at the modification history, you'll see that something was written over the original file between 11 p.m. and midnight on Tuesday. I was home with my daughter on Tuesday night. She had a fever. My babysitter can confirm I never left the house. Someone got into those files during that window, and I need you to let me show you the differential in the Mr. Walker. Victoria's voice was quiet, but it cut through his sentence like a blade. He stopped. She was looking at him with an expression he couldn't fully read. Not cold, not dismissive, but something more complicated than that. Something that looked almost like the face of a person who was doing something they had already decided was correct, but that still, somewhere in a part of themselves they hadn't fully examined, felt uncertain about. The investigation has been thorough, she said. The evidence in front of us is clear. The anomalies in Project Meridian represent not just a technical failure, but a significant breach of the protocols that protect this company and the people who depend on our systems. That's not, I need you to let me finish. Not harsh, but absolute. He let her finish. Langford Aviation is terminating your contract, effective immediately. Security will escort you to collect your personal items. You'll receive the severance outlined in your original agreement, and in exchange, we ask that you sign the standard non-disclosure. I won't sign anything, Ethan said. The room went very quiet. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't shaking or threatening or making it dramatic. He just said it, simply, completely, with the steadiness of a man who had already done the math on what he had left to lose and what he had left to protect. I won't sign anything, he said again, because I didn't do what you're saying I did, and signing a non-disclosure would mean accepting that I did. I built Project Meridian. I built it correctly. Someone in this building made sure you'd never know that, and I don't know yet why. But I know that's true. And I think somewhere, underneath whatever report is sitting in front of you right now, you know it too. He looked at her directly when he said that last part. It was the only moment in the entire meeting when he let the full weight of it show. Not anger exactly. Something more like grief. The grief of a person who had believed, maybe too naively, that evidence was enough, that truth had a natural advantage. Victoria Langford held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds. Then she looked down at the document on the table in front of her, picked up her pen, and signed it. Gerald Royce called security before she'd finished writing.
But
The security guard's name was Phil, and he'd been with Langford Aviation for 11 years. He was a large, quietly decent man who clearly hated the assignment he'd been given and went about it with the careful gentleness of someone trying to make an awful thing slightly less awful. He let Ethan take his time at his desk, didn't stand over him, got him a cardboard box from the supply room, and then found something to occupy himself with around the corner. Ethan's desk wasn't elaborate. He'd never been the type to accumulate a lot of personal effects in a workspace. A framed photo of Lily at 18 months, sitting in a wagon in their backyard with an expression of total self-satisfaction on her face. A small succulent in a terracotta pot that he'd kept alive through 2 office moves and a company restructure. A coffee mug Lily had given him for Father's Day the previous year that said "World's Best Daddy" in crooked painted letters because she'd done it herself at one of those pottery painting places and taken the task very seriously. He put all 3 things in the box. He didn't take anything else. Left the industry textbooks. Left the awards on the wall. 3 technical achievement commendations from the past 4 years. Left the whiteboard covered in his handwriting. 18 months of notes and diagrams that nobody else in the building would be able to fully decode. He picked up the box, nodded to Phil on his way out, and walked to the elevator. On the 43rd floor, he pressed the lobby button. The doors closed. In the polished stainless steel of the elevator wall, he caught a blurred reflection of himself. A man in his early 30s with a cardboard box and a succulent and a mug that said, "World's Best Daddy," riding down 43 floors in a building he'd given a year and a half of his best work to. He looked like what he was, a man who had just been hollowed out. The elevator reached the lobby. The doors opened. He walked out into the October morning. He drove home in silence, didn't turn on the radio, didn't call anyone, just drove. Lily was awake when he got home, the fever fully gone, in that particular post-illness state of heightened energy that children achieve once they've recovered and feel owed back all the vitality they lost. She was in the living room in her pajamas, constructing something elaborate out of couch cushions when he came through the door, and she looked up at him with those dark eyes she'd gotten from her mother. The one feature of her face that carried no echo of Ethan at all, and which he loved for exactly that reason. Daddy, she said, with the casual certainty of someone who had never doubted that her father would come home. Can you be the dragon? He set the cardboard box down on the floor just inside the door. Yeah, he said, I can be the dragon. The babysitter, Maria, saw the box, saw his face, made a quiet exit that told him she understood the shape of what had happened even without the details. He thanked her at the door, more genuinely than he probably managed to convey. He played dragon for 45 minutes. He crawled around the living room floor while Lily hit him with a pool noodle she called the Sword of Justice and narrated her own victory in real time with the breathless enthusiasm of a child who had never been self-conscious in her life. He roared when prompted. He fell dramatically when slain. He died 4 times, resurrected twice by Lily's decree, and died again at the end in a particularly theatrical fashion that made her shriek with delight. By the time she declared the dragon officially and permanently defeated and sat down on his chest to announce her triumph to the kingdom, Ethan was laughing. Real laughter, not the performance of it. The involuntary kind that bypasses everything else and finds you anyway. He wrapped both arms around her and held her there on the living room floor, while the late afternoon light came through the windows, and for about 30 seconds the whole world narrowed down to the weight of her, the sound of her laughing, and the absolute blunt fact that whatever they had taken from him today, everything else, the whole career, the whole future he'd imagined, this specific thing, this particular afternoon, this child, that was still entirely his. Then 30 seconds ended and the weight came back. The news moved through the industry faster than he expected. By the end of the week, his name was attached to the Meridian failure in 3 separate trade publications. Not front-page stories, the kind of brief, factual, devastating items buried in the industry section that managed to communicate everything without technically saying anything defamatory. Sources close to the investigation and questions surrounding protocol compliance and the contract termination comes amid broader concerns about project oversight. He called 3 attorneys. 2 of them reviewed the situation and told him, in varying degrees of direct language, that the combination of the signed documentation and the amended digital records made a legal challenge extremely difficult and potentially very expensive for an outcome that was, at best, uncertain. The third one was more blunt. They've built a clean paper trail. Whoever did this knew what they were doing. He applied for positions at 4 different aviation companies over the following 6 weeks. 2 of them declined without interview. 1 went quiet after a preliminary phone screen that had gone well. The 4th called him back only to tell him that they'd received his application, but that given recent events, they didn't feel they could move forward at this time. Recent events. As if his entire career had been reduced to a euphemism. He understood, by the end of those 6 weeks, what the landscape looked like. The aviation industry was smaller than it appeared. Reputation moved through it like weather. Fast, comprehensive, hard to argue with once it had settled. And the story that had settled was that Ethan Walker had made a catastrophic error on a major project, tried to deflect responsibility, and been terminated accordingly. Nobody who mattered was actively saying he'd done something dishonest. They didn't need to. The structure of the story did that work without anyone having to touch it. His savings were solid, but not indefinite. He had Lily, and Lily's needs were modest right now, but she was 4 years old, and 4 years old became 18 years old at a speed that he was already finding alarming in the best of circumstances. He had a mortgage on a house that had always been slightly too much for one income. He lay awake for 3 nights in a row doing math. Not complicated math, just the simple grinding arithmetic of a single father with a damaged name and a finite runway, running the numbers on what the next year looked like if nothing changed. On the 4th night, he stopped doing math and made a decision instead. He called his Uncle Ray the next morning. Raymond Walker was 63 years old, had never worked for a corporation in his life, and ran a small aircraft maintenance operation out of a converted hangar 20 miles east of a town called Millhaven, just south of the Cascades. He was the person who had taught Ethan to read aircraft schematics at age 11, who had given him his first look inside a turbine engine, who had spent a Saturday every month throughout Ethan's childhood turning a kid with no father into someone who understood how mechanical things worked and why that knowledge mattered. He also had a spare house on the edge of his property, a 2-bedroom with a porch that looked out over a stretch of fir trees that had been empty for 2 years since his last tenant moved to Portland. You want to come out here? Ray said. It wasn't a question exactly. It was the tone of a man who had been waiting for this call longer than Ethan had been ready to make it. If the offer's still open, Ethan said, I'll air out the house this weekend. A pause. How's she doing? She's good. She's really good. Kids that age are elastic, Ray said. They bounce. You're the one I'm asking about. Ethan looked out the window of his kitchen at the backyard, where Lily's plastic slide sat under the oak tree. She'd asked him 3 days ago if they were going on an adventure. He hadn't known how to answer that yet. He was still working out whether an adventure was what this was. I'm figuring it out, he said. That's all you can do, Ray said. Come on out. We'll put you to work. They moved in November. Lily was ecstatic about it in the way that children are ecstatic about any significant change when they're 4 years old and haven't yet developed the capacity to experience change as loss. She spent the entire drive to Millhaven with her face pressed against the rear window, watching the city give way to suburbs, give way to highway, and then finally to the long green corridor of the Cascades, asking questions at a rate that Ethan eventually stopped trying to keep up with, and simply acknowledged with a running that seemed to satisfy her. The house was small and smelled like cedar and wood smoke. The porch looked out over the fir trees exactly the way Ray had described. And in the late November afternoon light, with the mountains sitting blue and enormous at the edge of the horizon, it looked like something from a painting, the kind of painting people hang in places where they want to feel like the world makes sense. Lily stood on the porch railing with both hands and leaned out slightly, the way she always did with any elevated surface, testing it. Ethan stood behind her with one hand loosely on her collar, the way he always did when she did that. Is that our mountain? She asked, pointing at the horizon. That's the Cascades, he said. But is it ours? He looked at the mountains for a moment. In Seattle, he'd had a career and a reputation and a future that had turned out to be a house of cards. Out here, he had a 2-bedroom with cedar smell, an uncle who'd give him work, and a 4-year-old who wanted to know if the mountains belonged to them. Yeah, he said. That's ours. No. He started working for Ray within the week. Maintenance, diagnostics, repairs, the practical hands-on work that was, in its way, the foundation of everything theoretical he'd built his career on. The work was not glamorous. It was oil under fingernails and cold hanger floors in December, and the specific exhaustion that comes from physical labor after years of desk work. His hands, which had been accustomed to keyboards, became accustomed again to tools. He didn't hate it. That was the thing that surprised him most, that he didn't hate it. There was something in the directness of the work, the cause and effect clarity of a mechanical problem correctly diagnosed and correctly solved, that the corporate world had never quite offered him. When he fixed something out here, it stayed fixed. When he found a problem, nobody questioned whether it was actually a problem. The thing either worked or it didn't, and the evidence was right in front of you. The other pilots and maintenance workers who used Ray's operation were a mixed group. Retired commercial pilots maintaining private aircraft, agricultural flyers, charter operators who couldn't afford the Seattle shops. They were almost without exception people who had been in aviation long enough to have strong opinions and no patience for pretension. Ethan earned their respect the way respect was earned in places like that, by knowing what he was doing, by not making things up when he didn't know, and by fixing things correctly the first time. Within 6 months, they were bringing him problems that nobody else had been able to solve, unusual electrical gremlins, structural questions that required both engineering knowledge and practical experience, navigation systems with intermittent faults that were elusive enough to have stumped multiple technicians before landing in front of Ethan, who would sit with the problem quietly for as long as it took and then produce an answer that was almost always right. Word spread the way word spreads in small communities, slowly, then all at once. By the end of the first year, he had more work than Ray's operation could formally contain, and Ray offered him a formal partnership that Ethan accepted after thinking about it for approximately 1 day. He was not happy, exactly, the way that word gets used carelessly. He was something more durable than happy. He was functional. He was present. He came home at the end of every day to a daughter who was growing with a speed that he found both astonishing and slightly terrifying, and he was there for it, physically, mentally, consistently there in a way that the career he'd lost had never quite allowed. Lily started kindergarten in Millhaven, the following September, and came home the first day with paint on her left ear and a best friend named Sophie, and approximately 45 things to tell him in a row, delivered in the unstoppable rush of a child who has been holding everything in all day and finally has her safe person to unload on. He sat at the kitchen table and listened to all 45 things, asked questions, contributed responses that she evaluated with the particular seriousness with which small children evaluate adult opinions. He didn't know, sitting there at that kitchen table, that Victoria Langford was at that same moment standing in a glass-walled boardroom on the 52nd floor of a new tower in downtown Seattle, presiding over the announcement of Langford Aviation's expansion into the European market. He didn't know that she'd thought about him twice that week, for reasons she hadn't fully examined. He didn't know that the executive who had destroyed him was still in the building, still collecting his salary, still sitting on the technology that belonged to someone else. He didn't know any of that. He was listening to his daughter tell him about kindergarten. That was enough. For now, that was completely enough. The winters near the Cascades were different from Seattle winters, more serious, more committed, with a quality of cold that felt less like weather and more like an argument the mountains were making about the nature of things. Lily loved them. She was the kind of child who loved anything that had a strong position, and the Cascade winters had very strong positions. Ethan learned to love them too, in the slower, more deliberate way that adults learn to love things. Not the instant, unconditional love of a child, but the acquired appreciation of someone who has been somewhere long enough to understand what it offers. He learned the names of the regular pilots. He learned which ones were reliable and which ones were optimistic about their own mechanical abilities in ways that created problems. He learned the particular texture of the regional weather patterns, the way storms came in off the Pacific, and what they typically meant for flight operations, which local airports had the best instrument approaches, which ones had quirks that weren't in the official documentation, but that every pilot who flew the region knew by feel. He built things, in his off hours, the way he'd always built things. Not to sell them, not for recognition, just because problems were interesting and solutions felt good. Small improvements to diagnostic tools. A software modification for an older navigation system that made it significantly more reliable in low-visibility conditions. A structural analysis approach for aging airframes that saved two of Ray's clients thousands of dollars in unnecessary overhaul work. He didn't publish any of it, didn't try to patent it, just used it, shared it locally, let it do the work it was designed to do. Ray watched all of this with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had suspected, from the moment his nephew showed up with a cardboard box and a 5-year-old, that Ethan would eventually figure out that what he'd lost wasn't the most important thing he had. "You're not angry anymore," Ray said to him one evening in the second year, the two of them sitting on the porch with coffee while Lily slept inside. Ethan thought about that. "I don't know if that's true." "You're not carrying it the same way," Ray said. "When you first got here, you had the weight on you all the time. Even when you were laughing, you had it." "It's still there," Ethan said. "I just stopped letting it be the loudest thing." Ray nodded. "That's the work," he said. "That's the actual hard work, right there." They sat with that for a while. Below the porch, in the dark beyond the tree line, something moved. A deer, probably, or one of the raccoons that treated Ray's property as a personal buffet. The mountains were invisible in the dark, but you could feel them there. The way you can feel a large thing even when you can't see it. Ethan drank his coffee, listened to the dark, thought about a woman who had signed a document without looking at him, and found, to his genuine surprise, that what he felt when he thought about her now was not rage or bitterness, but something quieter and stranger. Pity, maybe, or something adjacent to it. He thought about the look on her face in that brief 3-second window before she'd picked up the pen. The way it hadn't been the face of someone who was certain. The way it had been, unmistakably, the face of someone making a choice they already knew they might not be able to live with cleanly. He didn't forgive her. He wasn't built for that kind of clean narrative resolution, and he was honest enough with himself to know it, but he stopped letting her live rent-free in the center of his chest, which was, for now, a different thing. A smaller thing, but the kind of smaller thing that turns out to matter enormously. The coffee went cold. He went inside. Checked on Lily, who was sleeping with her arm thrown over her face in that particular way she had, like even her sleep was emphatic. He turned off her light, went to bed. Outside, the Cascades stood in the dark, where they always stood, patient and enormous, and entirely indifferent to the small, difficult human business of deciding what to carry and what to set down. The second year was harder than the first in ways Ethan hadn't anticipated. The first year had the momentum of crisis behind it. The forward motion of a man who had to keep moving because stopping meant looking at the full shape of what had happened to him. There was the move, the adjustment, the physical work, the newness of everything. Newness is its own kind of anesthesia. It keeps you occupied with the surface of things while the deeper damage does what it needs to do underneath, out of direct view. The second year, the newness wore off. Millhaven was just where he lived now. Ray's hangar was just where he worked. The mountains were just the mountains. And without the constant, low-grade distraction of adaptation, the thing he'd been out running caught up with him somewhere around February, in the middle of a Tuesday night, while he was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea he'd forgotten to drink, and a legal pad full of calculations for a turbine diagnostic he was running the next morning. He sat there in the quiet of the house and understood, with a clarity that felt less like insight and more like a door opening into a room he'd been avoiding, that he was profoundly alone, not in the shallow social sense. He had Ray. He had the pilots and mechanics who'd become something close to friends over the past year. He had Lily, who was 5 now, and had opinions about everything and filled every room she entered with a kind of cheerful ambient noise that he'd come to need the way he needed coffee. He was not lonely in the obvious way. He was alone in the way that specific men in their 30s are alone when they have spent so long being competent and functional and forward-moving that the interior life has gotten somewhere behind them without their noticing. And one quiet Tuesday night, the gap becomes visible, and it is larger than expected. He thought about Claire. He didn't do that often. He'd gotten careful about it, the way you get careful about the edges of things that can cut you. Claire had left when Lily was 11 months old, not dramatically, not with anger, but with the particular tired honesty of a woman who had tried to want the life she was living and finally run out of energy to pretend that she did. She wasn't a villain in the story. She was just a person who had made a mistake in marrying someone whose entire gravity pointed toward work and ambition in a way that left the other parts of a marriage thin and starved. She sent money every month, more than her legal obligation, and cards on Lily's birthday that were always warm and specific in ways that made it clear she thought about her daughter more than her absence suggested. Lily called her sometimes on the tablet, awkward, slightly formal calls that were getting less awkward as Lily got older, and developed the conversational sophistication to bridge the gap between them. Ethan was careful never to speak badly of her to Lily, not because he had resolved his feelings about how it ended, but because Lily was not the place for those feelings. And he was clear on that, even on the nights when being clear on it was difficult. That Tuesday in February, he let himself think about Claire for a while. Not with bitterness, more with the strange, distant tenderness you can develop for a person, once enough time has passed and the wound has become scar tissue. He thought about the early years, before Lily, before the marriage started showing its structural weaknesses. The apartment in Capitol Hill, the way she'd laughed at his terrible cooking with genuine delight, as if his incompetence in the kitchen was one of her favorite things about him. He'd loved her. That was true. He'd loved her, and he'd also, without meaning to, and without fully understanding he was doing it, made her feel consistently secondary to the work. He'd gotten better at understanding that about himself in Millhaven, partly because the work here was different, more bounded, with clearer edges, something he could leave behind in the hangar when he drove home, and partly because Lily required him to be present in a way that the corporate career had never demanded of him. He pushed the legal pad aside, drank the cold tea because getting up to pour a new cup felt like more than he wanted to manage right now, sat in the kitchen of the Cedar House and listened to the quiet. Through the wall, he could hear Lily breathing in her sleep, or thought he could, though the wall was too thick for that, so what he was actually hearing was the particular quality of the house's silence that meant she was there, and she was fine. He'd learned to read that silence in the first year, the way new parents learn to read a monitor. Its presence meant everything was okay. He went to bed. He didn't sleep well. In the morning, he got up at 5:30 and made coffee and drove to the hangar as the sun was coming up over the eastern ridge, painting the snow on the peaks in shades of amber and rose that he'd never quite gotten over despite 2 years of seeing it regularly. Lily was still asleep when he left. Maria, his babysitter, who had relocated from Seattle as much for the quality of life as for the continued work, would get her up and take her to school. Ray was already in the hangar when Ethan arrived, which was not unusual. Ray operated on some internal schedule that bore no relationship to conventional morning hours. He was simply always there, existing in the hangar the way a particular tool exists in a particular drawer, completely natural in its location. "You look like you slept in a drainage ditch," Ray said, not looking up from the Cessna he was pre-flighting. "I appreciate your concern," Ethan said. "Not concerned, just descriptive." Ray handed him a coffee from the thermos on the workbench without being asked. "Lily have a rough night?" "Lily slept fine. I had a rough night." Ray nodded, absorbed this, said nothing else about it. That was one of the things Ethan valued most about his uncle, the ability to acknowledge something without requiring it to become a conversation. The coffee was strong and bad in the specific way of thermos coffee that has been sitting for an hour, and Ethan drank it gratefully. They worked through the morning in the comfortable parallel quiet of two people who knew each other's habits well enough not to need to fill the silence. Around 10, a pilot named Dale Hutchinson came in with a Piper Cherokee that was throwing an intermittent voltage warning on the electrical bus. The third time he'd brought the same problem in 6 weeks, each time to a different shop, each time leaving with a diagnosis that turned out to be incomplete. Ethan spent 40 minutes with the Cherokee. He didn't rush it, didn't reach for the obvious first explanation. He worked through the system methodically, tracing the circuit, asking Dale questions about exactly when the warning appeared and under what conditions, building the picture of the problem the way you build any picture. One specific detail at a time until the shape of it becomes clear. "It's not the bus," he told Dale eventually. "It's a grounding issue at the alternator mounting bracket. The bracket's developed a micro crack. You can barely see it, but it's just enough to create an intermittent loss of ground under specific load conditions. Every shop you've been to has been checking the obvious stuff. Nobody's looked at the mounting hardware." Dale stared at him. "I've had 3 different shops tell me the alternator was fine." "The alternator is fine," Ethan said. "The thing holding the alternator to the engine is not." He showed Dale the crack with a flashlight. "You had to angle it just right to see it. A hairline fracture running along the bottom edge of the bracket. Easy to miss. The kind of thing you only found if you were looking for what wasn't obvious, which required being willing to discard your assumptions about what was obvious." Dale got quiet for a moment. "How long would it have taken for that to become a real problem?" "Depends on flight hours and load cycles," Ethan said. "But you'd have known about it eventually, and you'd have preferred to know about it on the ground." Dale didn't say anything for a beat. Then, "What do I owe you for the diagnosis?" "We'll figure it out after we fix it." The repair took an hour and a half. Dale stood nearby and watched, asking questions the way pilots ask questions about their aircraft. Not skeptically, but with the focused interest of a person who understands that the machine he depends on deserves to be understood. By the time they were done, Ethan had answered most of them, and Dale had answered several of Ethan's questions about the particular flight characteristics of the Cascades corridor that he'd been curious about. This was, Ethan had come to understand, the best part of the work. Not the fixing itself, though there was real satisfaction in that, but the conversation around the fixing, the way a mechanical problem opened up a human conversation, the way trust got built in stages. First you proved you knew what you were doing, then the person across from you started telling you things they wouldn't have told a stranger. Dale left with a solid aircraft and what looked like the beginning of a genuine sense of relief. Ethan washed his hands at the hangar sink and thought that there were worse ways to spend a life than being the person who found the thing everyone else had missed. It didn't fix the hollow Tuesday night feeling entirely, but it helped. It helped more than he usually gave it credit for. The years arranged themselves around moments like that one. Not a smooth, upward line. That would be the wrong picture entirely. There were months that were genuinely hard. Periods when the professional injustice of what had happened felt so specific and vivid that it crowded out everything else. When he'd be in the middle of something ordinary, and the memory of that conference room would surface with such clarity that it felt less like memory and more like he was still inside it, still watching Victoria Langford's pen move across that document. There was the month Lily turned 6, and her kindergarten class did a project about what their parents did for work, and Lily had told her teacher with complete seriousness that her daddy fixed airplanes and was very smart, and the teacher had relayed this to Ethan at pickup with the warmth teachers reserve for genuinely sweet things children say. And Ethan had driven home with something complicated happening in his chest that he couldn't have named cleanly. Pride in his daughter's uncomplicated faith in him, and underneath that, the grinding awareness of everything he'd been before and what had been done to it. There was the evening, about 3 years in, when he was on the porch after Lily had gone to sleep, and Ray came and sat with him, and they didn't talk for a long time. And eventually Ray said, out of nowhere, "You ever going to try to fight it?" Ethan knew what he was talking about. "The case is cold. The paper trail's been locked for years. I'd spend everything I have and come out with nothing except a record of having tried." "That's not what I asked." "Yeah," Ethan said. "I know." A pause. The dark was doing what dark does out near the Cascades, settling in with commitment, the stars sharper than the city ever let them be. "I used to run it in my head," Ethan said. "Every variation, every possible angle. What I could prove, what I couldn't. Who might testify? What documentation existed somewhere that they hadn't gotten to yet?" He paused. "And every time I ran it, at the end of it was Lily. What fighting it would cost her in terms of me being here, present, stable. What it would cost in terms of money that was supposed to be hers eventually. What it would cost in terms of years of my life spent looking backward instead of forward." Ray was quiet. "It's not forgiveness," Ethan said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not sitting here at peace with what happened. What they did to me was wrong, and I know it, and I haven't stopped knowing it for a single day. But I only have so many years, and she only has one father." He looked at the dark where the mountains were. "And it's not close. When I actually look at the choice, it's not even close." Ray exhaled slowly. "Your father would have made the same choice," he said. "If you were wondering." Ethan hadn't known his father well enough to have opinions about what choices he would have made. He'd died when Ethan was 7. A car accident on the I-90 in February, black ice, nothing dramatic. Just the abrupt absence that becomes the shape of your life when you're 7 years old, and your father is suddenly past tense. Ray was the one who had stepped into that gap, without fanfare, without anyone asking him to, just because the gap was there, and someone who loved Ethan was available to fill it. "I wasn't wondering," Ethan said, "but thanks." They sat on the porch a while longer. A great horned owl made its presence known somewhere in the firs, a sound Lily could identify now with total confidence, which she demonstrated approximately 40 times over the past year whenever they heard it. Ethan smiled at the sound despite himself. "She's something," Ray said, meaning Lily. "Yeah," Ethan said, "she really is." Lily at 6 was decisive and loud and deeply interested in anything mechanical, which had emerged as a genuine trait rather than a performance of her father's interests. She would come to the hangar on Saturdays and sit on a stool near wherever Ethan was working and ask questions with the focused relentlessness of a small person who has decided that understanding something is important and is prepared to pursue that understanding at whatever cost to the surrounding adults. Ray had taken to giving her small tasks, handing tools, holding a light at a specific angle, and she approached these with a seriousness that made the older pilots grin in the particular way that competent children make competent adults grin. "She gonna be an engineer?" Dale Hutchinson had asked once, watching her hold a trouble light perfectly steady for a solid 8 minutes while Ethan worked inside an access panel. "I don't know what she's going to be," Ethan said honestly. "I think she might be the kind of person who's good at everything and has to narrow it down eventually, which honestly sounds exhausting. Smart problem to have." "Ask me again when she's 17. Lily grew the way kids grow in small towns near mountains, with space in the growth, room to expand laterally rather than just vertically, accumulating a kind of groundedness that the city doesn't quite manufacture. She knew the names of the peaks. She knew the phases of the moon with confident accuracy. She knew every pilot who used Ray's operation by first name and had strong opinions about most of them. Sophie, her best friend from kindergarten, lived 3 miles down the road, and the two of them had developed a friendship of the intense, specific, slightly exclusive kind that certain childhood friendships achieve. Their own references, their own shorthand, their own elaborate mythology about the stretch of woods between their properties that was either enchanted or haunted, depending on which version of the story they were telling. Ethan watched all of it with the particular helpless affection of a parent who understands intellectually that childhood is temporary and is experiencing that knowledge not as wisdom, but as a low, continuous ache. She was growing. He was glad. He also wanted everything to slow down, which was a contradiction he'd learned to live with. By the time Lily was 10, Ethan's reputation in the regional aviation community had become something genuinely remarkable, though he would have been uncomfortable with that description. He thought of himself as someone who fixed things. The community thought of him as someone who fixed the things nobody else could fix, which is a different and more specific category. His name traveled between airports in the way that only names attached to real competence travel, not through marketing or reputation management, but through the simple accumulation of situations where something was broken, and Ethan Walker was the person who found out why. He'd been offered 3 jobs during that time, each one from a larger operation than the last. First, a regional carrier's maintenance director position, then a position at a Seattle-based avionics company, and finally, in Lily's 9th year, a senior engineering role at a mid-sized aerospace firm that would have represented a significant reconstruction of the career the Langford termination had dismantled. He turned down all 3. The first 2 were easy decisions. The third required a longer conversation with himself, a few evenings on the porch with cold coffee and the mountains doing their patient thing in the distance. The aerospace firm's recruiter, a woman named Janet, who was professional and persistent in the way of someone who understood she was asking for a significant yes, had made the pitch carefully and thoroughly during a phone call that lasted nearly an hour. The role, the compensation, which was genuinely significant, the team, the work itself, which was exactly the kind of work that the part of Ethan that would always be an engineer found legitimately compelling. "I need some time to think about it," he'd told her. "Of course," Janet said. "Can I ask, is it the role, or is there something about the location that's a concern? Because there may be flexibility on—" "It's not the location," he said. "Give me a week." He took the week. He drove Lily to school and picked her up. He worked in the hangar. He watched his daughter do homework at the kitchen table with the focused ferocity she brought to anything she'd decided mattered. He sat on the porch. He looked at the mountains. He called Janet back at the end of the week. "I appreciate the offer," he said. "I genuinely do. But I'm going to stay where I am." A pause on the other end. "Can I ask why? Off the record, if you prefer." "Off the record," Ethan said. "I built something out here that I'd have to walk away from to take that job. Not professionally, personally. And I looked at what I'd be trading and what I'd be getting, and the math doesn't work for me." Janet was quiet for a moment. "Fair enough," she said. She sounded like she meant it. "If that changes, the door's open." "I appreciate that." He hung up and stood in the kitchen and waited to feel regret, the way you sometimes wait for pain you know is coming. It didn't come. What came instead was something quieter and more settled, the particular piece of a decision made for reasons you actually believe in, which is a different quality from the piece of a decision made because you were afraid of the alternative. He'd been afraid, in that first year, more than he'd admitted to anyone. Afraid that leaving the corporate world meant accepting a diminished version of himself. Afraid that building a small life instead of a large career was a kind of defeat in disguise. Afraid that the people who destroyed him had, in some sense he couldn't articulate, succeeded not just in ending his career but in reducing him. He understood now, at the end of Lily's 9th year, that they had done nothing of the kind. They had moved him sideways out of a lane he'd been in, and the lane he'd ended up in turned out to fit him better than the original one. That wasn't a comfortable thing to admit because it handed the people who'd wronged him a consequence they hadn't deserved, the accidental gift of having shoved him toward something that turned out to matter more. He didn't feel grateful for what they'd done. He never would. But he'd stopped confusing the outcome with the action, which was its own kind of clarity. Lily turned 11 that year and celebrated with a party at Ray's hangar, which was her specific request because Sophie and 4 other friends could handle the novelty of a birthday party in a place that smelled like aviation fuel and had an actual small aircraft inside it. Ray had decorated with a level of enthusiasm that Ethan found simultaneously touching and mildly alarming. Streamers in yellow and white, a banner that read, "Happy Birthday, Lily," that had clearly been put up by someone who had never hung a banner before. Balloons that listed in the updraft from the hangar ventilation. Lily had walked in, looked at the streamers, looked at Ray, and said, with the evaluative seriousness of an 11-year-old who has opinions, "Uncle Ray, this is amazing." Ray had looked quietly delighted in the way that unsentimental men look when something they did actually landed. The cake had been chocolate and lopsided because Ethan had made it himself, having decided that a store-bought cake wasn't sufficient for an 11th birthday, and then somewhat overestimating his baking competence. Lily had declared it the best cake she'd ever had, with the particular loyalty of a child who understands instinctively that the effort mattered more than the execution. He'd photographed her with the lopsided cake and the streamers and the genuine happy noise of 5 middle schoolers in a hangar, and the photo had gone on the kitchen wall alongside all the others. The wagon photo from the apartment in Seattle, the Bumblebee Halloween, the mountains on the first day in Mill Haven. That wall of photographs was the truest record he had of the years since the termination, not what he'd lost. What he'd been here for instead. It wasn't a simple accounting. He wasn't trying to make it one. There was still the wrong that had been done to him, still the work that had been stolen, and the career that had been burned down by someone else's calculation, still the specific injustice of knowing that the man who had done it was somewhere, still employed, still comfortable, still living inside a version of events he'd constructed to protect himself. Ethan thought about that sometimes. Not as often as he once had, but sometimes. On the quiet evenings, in the hours between Lily's bedtime and his own. He thought about the executive whose name he still knew, whose specific methods of record manipulation he'd reconstructed in his own mind over the years, with an engineer's precision, understanding exactly how the thing had been done even without being able to prove it in a way anyone else would accept. He wondered occasionally if it would ever surface, if someone else would eventually make the same enemy, or if the technology he'd built would eventually be visible enough in the company's operations that someone paying attention would notice the discontinuity between when it supposedly originated and how fully formed it had arrived. He didn't count on it. He'd learned not to count on justice finding its own way. That was a story people told to make themselves feel better about the frequency with which it didn't. But he thought about it. Not with the burning urgency of the early years. More the way you think about a debt that's outstanding in someone else's ledger. Not your immediate problem, but not forgotten. Lily was 12 when she came home from school one afternoon and found him at the kitchen table with a notebook, working through a navigation algorithm he'd been developing in his head for the past several weeks. A cleaner approach to real-time weather integration in flight management systems that had come to him while he was in the middle of replacing a brake assembly on a Beechcraft, the way his best ideas always came to him, sideways, while his hands were doing something else. She dropped her backpack on the chair next to him and looked over his shoulder at the notebook for a moment. "Is that a routing algorithm?" she asked. He looked at her. "How do you know what a routing algorithm looks like?" "Sophie's mom's a software developer," she said, with the easy authority of a 12-year-old explaining something obvious. "I've seen her work. It looks like that. It's a weather integration protocol," he said, "for flight management." She pulled the notebook closer and studied it with the focused seriousness she brought to things she found genuinely interesting. He waited, curious. "Why does it loop back here?" She pointed to a section of the algorithm. "Instead of just feeding forward?" He stared at her for a moment, then he explained why. She listened, asked a follow-up question that was better than the first one, and then went to get a snack and came back and asked 2 more. He sat at the kitchen table for a long time after she'd wandered off to do homework, looking at the notebook, thinking about his daughter who was 12 years old and had spotted something meaningful in a navigation algorithm after looking at it for 30 seconds. Outside, the mountains were doing their late afternoon thing, catching the light from the west and holding it in ways that made the snowfields look like they were lit from inside. He'd stopped noticing them, mostly, the way you stop noticing things that are always beautiful. But sometimes they caught him still, the way they caught him now, looking up from the notebook, and he understood all over again why he was here and not somewhere else. His phone buzzed on the table. A text from Ray. "Challenger 350 coming in tomorrow. Owner says autopilot's intermittent. Told him you'd look at it." He texted back, "Fine. Early." Ray sent back a thumbs up. Ethan put the phone face down on the table and looked at the mountains for another minute. Then he picked up the notebook and went back to the algorithm, making a small notation near the section Lily had questioned. She was right to question it. He could make it cleaner. He worked until dinner, and then he cooked, competently, nothing impressive. The practical home cooking of someone who'd taught himself the basics out of necessity and gotten good enough to be reliable if not inspired. Lily ate quickly and with appetite, narrating her day between bites in the non-stop way that hadn't changed since she was 5, just grown more sophisticated in its content. Sophie drama. A history test she'd done well on. An opinion about a book they were reading in English class that she delivered with the conviction of someone who expected her literary views to be taken seriously. He took them seriously. He asked questions. He pushed back on one point gently, just enough that she had to defend her position, which she did with the particular intensity of a person who likes being challenged, even when they won't admit it. By 8 o'clock, she was in her room doing the rest of her homework, music playing softly through the door. Some artist he half recognized, didn't know well, filed in his mental category of things that were now part of her life rather than their shared life, which was how it was supposed to go, and which he didn't entirely hate, even when he slightly hated it. He cleaned up the kitchen, stood at the window over the sink looking out at the dark, the owl somewhere in the firs again, the smell of wood smoke from somewhere up the road where a neighbor had a fire going. 15 miles away, at Millhaven Regional Airport, the night crew was running their standard checks. The instrument landing system was functioning within normal parameters. The weather radar showed a developing low-pressure system moving in from the coast. Standard Pacific weather, the kind the Cascades region swallowed without drama 100 times a year. 200 miles south, at Seattle-Tacoma International, the operations were running the complex round-the-clock machinery of a major international hub. Thousands of people moving through, dozens of flights an hour. The layered infrastructure of navigation and communication and ground control and weather integration that made modern aviation possible. Infrastructure, some of it, that ran on logic built by people who didn't know they'd borrowed it from a man in a small town near the Cascades who was washing dishes at 8 o'clock on a Wednesday evening, not particularly thinking about any of it. He dried his hands, turned off the kitchen light, checked that the front door was locked and the porch light was on. An old habit from the early Millhaven winters when the cold came fast and certain and you wanted the light on for anyone coming home in the dark. He went to bed. He had an early start tomorrow because of the Challenger 350. He'd be thinking about the autopilot intermittency on the drive in, working the problem before he'd even touched the aircraft, which was how he always worked. He set his alarm for 5, closed his eyes. Somewhere in the gap between wakefulness and sleep, a thought surfaced that he didn't quite pursue. Something about the weather system coming in from the coast, the way the pressure gradient looked on the radar image he'd seen on his phone that afternoon. The particular combination of variables that he knew, from years of working in this region, sometimes produce conditions more serious than the standard models predicted. He noted it distantly and slept. He didn't know yet what that system was going to become. He didn't know yet what it was going to bring. The weather system that had registered as a distant smudge on the radar the night before arrived with none of the gradual buildup that the forecast models had predicted, and all of the intensity that Ethan, lying in that half-sleep state, had dimly registered as possible. He knew it was serious before he got out of bed. He could hear it in the way the wind was moving through the firs, not the standard Pacific coastal sound, which had a rhythm to it, a push and release that the trees had their own way of answering, but something harder and more sustained. A pressure sound, the kind that meant the system had organized itself in transit and arrived as something more consolidated than it had started. He checked his phone at 5:15. The regional weather service had upgraded the advisory at 4:42 a.m. What had been a standard Pacific low had deepened rapidly overnight, the kind of meteorological intensification that the models consistently underperformed on in this specific geographic corridor, because the interaction between the incoming maritime air and the Cascade terrain created feedback effects that the standard prediction algorithms treated as edge cases. Ethan had argued this point in a paper he'd written 4 years ago and distributed exactly nowhere because the audience for a technically rigorous critique of regional weather modeling in the Pacific Northwest was, in practical terms, himself and Ray. Wind gusts were being reported at the coast at 63 miles per hour. That number, in the Cascade corridor, meant something different than it meant in open terrain. It meant the gusts would channel and amplify through the mountain passes in ways that wouldn't be fully reflected in the surface observations. And it meant that airports sitting in the rain shadow zones would get conditions that looked, on paper, more manageable than they actually were. He texted Ray, "Don't come in yet. Let me check the Millhaven field conditions first." Ray texted back within 30 seconds, which meant he'd also been awake. Already on it, Windsock is doing something I've never seen it do. Ethan got up, made coffee in the dark, and stood at the kitchen window while it brewed. The firs were moving like they had opinions about the wind, bending in the direction of the gusts and then snapping back with more force than seemed structurally advisable. The way trees in serious weather always look slightly more fragile than you'd thought. The sky was the color of old pewter, uniform and low, sitting heavily on the ridgeline to the west. Maria wasn't due until 7:30. He wrote a note for Lily and left it on the kitchen table under her cereal bowl in the place she always looked first. "Big storm, went to the hangar early, Maria's coming, have a good day, call me at lunch." And then he drove to the airport in the half-dark with his coffee in the cup holder and the radio cycling through a weather advisory that was still not quite catching up to what the sky outside his windshield was telling him. Millhaven Regional was quiet when he arrived, which was appropriate given the conditions. Ray was in the office rather than the hangar, sitting in front of the weather display with a mug of his own coffee and the focused expression of someone reading a situation rather than simply observing it. 3 aircraft diverted overnight, Ray said without looking up. Seattle Approach has been issuing advisories since about 3 a.m. It's getting bad up there. How bad? Ray turned the monitor so Ethan could see the full picture. The radar showed the system as a dense, rotating mass sitting directly over the Puget Sound Basin, with the worst of the precipitation band draped across the Seattle-Tacoma corridor. The wind shear data, overlaid in the secondary display, looked like something had spilled a jar of angry arrows across the airspace. ILS at SeaTac is marginal, Ray said. They've been operating on Cat 2 approach protocols since about 2 diversions to Portland, 1 to Spokane. He paused. And there's a medical transport in the queue. Organ Transport, Seattle General is the receiving hospital. They've been holding the flight in Boise, waiting for a window that isn't coming. Ethan looked at the display. The organ transport detail landed differently than the others. More specific weight, more immediate stakes. What organ? Heart. Pediatric. He didn't say anything for a moment, just looked at the weather display and did the math that pilots and aviation people do automatically, running the variables, timing, system movement, the likely behavior of the shear band based on the terrain interaction, the probability of conditions improving to Cat 1 approach minimums in the next 2 to 4 hours. The window is going to be narrow, he said. Maybe 45 minutes around mid-morning if the southern edge of the system tracks the way I think it will. But it depends on what's happening at SeaTac's ground infrastructure. Ray looked at him. Their ATIS has been cycling normally. That's not what I mean. Ethan pulled up the secondary display on the adjacent monitor and typed in the access sequence for the Regional Aviation Network's shared diagnostic feed, a system that Ray's operation, as a certified maintenance provider, had legitimate access to. I mean the actual infrastructure, the ILS signal quality, the approach lighting, the surface detection systems. In a storm like this, especially if there's been any flooding near the instrument arrays, you can get degraded performance that the ATIS doesn't capture because the monitoring thresholds are set too conservatively. The system shows green when the real-world performance is marginal. Ray watched him work. You think there's a problem at SeaTac? I think there might be, Ethan said. I want to see the raw data. What he found, over the next 40 minutes, was initially not alarming, and then, the longer he looked at it, increasingly difficult to explain in a way that was reassuring. The instrument landing system at SeaTac's primary runway complex was showing performance metrics that were within the technical certification parameters, just barely within them in the case of the localizer signal, and the glide slope data had a specific pattern of micro variations that, taken individually, meant nothing, but stacked across the previous 6 hours told a story about signal integrity that was subtler and more troubling than the green status indicator suggested. He'd seen this pattern before. Not at SeaTac specifically, but in the behavior of ILS systems under the kind of sustained electromagnetic interference that could be generated by the specific combination of heavy precipitation and the type of low-frequency atmospheric electrical activity that accompanies certain deep Pacific systems. It wasn't in the standard failure mode textbooks because it was rare enough and subtle enough that most of the cases where it had caused problems had been attributed, after the fact, to other factors. He'd written about it. In the same paper nobody had read, the one about regional weather modeling. There had been an appendix about ground infrastructure behavior under deep Pacific storm conditions that he'd included because the data was interesting, not because he thought anyone would ever need it. He pulled up his own files on the laptop he'd brought in, an old machine, scratched and durable, that held years of his own research and documentation in a folder structure that would have looked chaotic to anyone else and was completely logical to him. "Ray," he said quietly, "call your contact at SeaTac Operations." Ray looked at him. 15 years of working with Ethan had given him a specific ability to read his nephew's tone, and the tone right now was the one that meant something was wrong in a way that wasn't going to resolve itself. "Tell me what I'm calling about." Tell them their ILS localizer on the primary complex is showing a degradation pattern that their monitoring system is probably not flagging because the variations are below the automated threshold. But if I'm reading this data correctly, the actual approach guidance under Cat 2 conditions is less reliable than their status board is showing, and they need to run a manual signal verification before they bring any more traffic in on that instrument approach. Ray was already reaching for the phone. "You sure?" "No," Ethan said, which is exactly why they need to verify it manually instead of assuming I'm wrong. Ray made the call. It took 4 minutes to get through to someone in operations with the authority to take the concern seriously because the operations center at a major international airport in the middle of a significant weather event is, by definition, a place where everyone is already dealing with something, and an incoming call from a small regional maintenance operation outside Seattle about a possible ILS anomaly that their own systems weren't showing was not, on the face of it, the highest priority item in the room. Ray had, over a career spanning 4 decades, developed a particular phone manner for moments like this. Unhurried, specific, and carrying the quiet authority of someone who had been around long enough to know exactly how important it was to not sound panicked when the situation warranted urgency. He gave them the data points Ethan was feeding him across the desk. He gave them the specific parameter range to check. He gave them Ethan's name as the source of the analysis, which he knew would mean nothing to them, and then he gave them his own name, which meant slightly more. The operations supervisor on the other end agreed to run a manual check and call back. They called back in 22 minutes. The woman who called back had a voice that was professionally controlled in the way of people who work in high-pressure operations environments and learn to modulate their affect as a functional tool. And what Ethan heard underneath the control was the specific register of someone who had just found something they hadn't been looking for and was still absorbing the implications. "The manual verification confirms a degradation in the localizer signal," she said. "The automated monitoring flagged it as within parameters. The manual check shows it's at the low edge of the certification threshold under current conditions. But the variance pattern..." A brief pause. "The variance pattern is consistent with what your source described. We're taking the primary complex offline for inspection and switching to secondary approach procedures." Ray looked at Ethan across the desk. "The medical transport," Ethan said. Ray relayed it. The operations supervisor said the medical transport had been rerouted from Boise to Boeing Field, where the approach infrastructure was unaffected by the current system, and ground transport had been arranged to bridge the distance to Seattle General. Ray thanked her and hung up. The hangar was very quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind was still making its argument with the fir trees. The light through the office windows was gray and flat and strange, in the way of serious storm light. "How did you know?" Ray said. "I didn't know," Ethan said. "I had a pattern recognition from data I've spent 15 years looking at." He closed the laptop. His hands were steady, which he found mildly interesting because his heart was doing something less steady. Not from the crisis itself, but from the abrupt awareness of how close it had been. The math of what would have happened if the transport had been rerouted to SeaTac's primary complex before someone caught the anomaly. "There was a child," he said. Not to Ray specifically, more to the room. "There was," Ray said. Neither of them said anything else for a while. What Ethan didn't know, sitting in Ray's office with the wind outside and the cold coffee going colder beside him, was that SeaTac's operations center had made 3 calls within 15 minutes of hanging up with Ray. One to their technical operations team, one to the FAA regional office, and one to the corporate operations center of Langford Aviation, whose major conference, the Global Aviation Infrastructure Summit, the largest event on the company's calendar, the one Victoria Langford had been preparing for the better part of 8 months, was scheduled to begin in 36 hours in the conference center attached to SeaTac's main terminal building. He didn't know any of that. He drove home through the tail end of the storm, which was beginning to pull east and thin at its southern edges the way he'd predicted, and made Lily lunch when she got home from school, and listened to her tell him about the tree branch that had come down on the school playground during second period, which she described with the detailed enthusiasm of someone narrating a major geological event. "Were you worried?" she asked him at some point, meaning about the storm. "A little," he said. "In the morning, it was worse than forecast." "But you figured it out," she said. Not as a question. The way she always said things about him when they involved technical problems. The settled confidence of a child who had never once in her life seen her father fail to find the answer. He didn't tell her how thin the margin had been. She was 19 now, not 5, old enough to hear harder things. But this particular hard thing felt like it needed to stay in the morning's context, between him and Ray and the gray stormlight and the weight of what almost happened and didn't. "Go do your homework," he said. She went. The Langford Aviation Global Aviation Infrastructure Summit was the company's flagship annual event. Part industry conference, part showcase, part diplomatic exercise in the specific politics of international aviation governance. Victoria had expanded it from the modest regional gathering her father had started into a 3-day event that drew 200 industry leaders from 30 countries and generated the kind of coverage that translated, in practical terms, into contracts and partnerships worth billions over the following year. This year's summit was also, though the public materials described it in more measured terms, a launch event for what Langford's marketing team was calling Next Sky, the company's new generation of integrated aviation management software, the centerpiece of the past 3 years of internal development, the system that Victoria had personally championed and that her technical teams had been promising, represented a fundamental leap in real-time airspace management. She had been preparing for this summit the way she prepared for everything important, obsessively, comprehensively, with the attention to detail of someone who had learned early that the difference between good outcomes and great ones usually lived in the preparation that happened before anyone was watching. She'd arrived in Seattle 2 days early. She was staying in the terminal-adjacent hotel because she wanted to be able to walk to the venue, because getting in a car required a driver, and a driver required a schedule, and she needed to be able to move on her own timeline. She'd done 3 walkthroughs of the conference space. She'd reviewed the technical setup for the Next Sky demonstration 3 times with the technical team. She'd personally read every background brief on the 37 keynote attendees. She had not slept well in approximately 4 days, which was her standard pre-summit state, and which she managed with coffee and the particular focused energy of a person who has trained herself to run on less than she needs when the situation requires it. The storm hit the night before the conference was scheduled to begin. She'd watched it from her hotel room window at 2 a.m, standing with a glass of water she'd gotten up to drink and then forgotten to drink, watching the weather do things to the airport complex outside that were more dramatic than the forecast had suggested. Her phone had started at 5:30 a.m. Not with the calls she expected. Logistics, the catering vendor with a question, the AV team with a last-minute concern, but with a call from her director of operations, Marcus Chen, whose number at that hour meant something had gone wrong in a way that was specific and serious. "Tell me," she said without preamble. SeaTac took the primary ILS complex offline about an hour ago, Marcus said. Signal degradation. They caught it before it became a problem, apparently on the basis of an external tip, but the inspection has identified a component that needs replacement, and they're saying 4 to 6 hours for the technical work. Victoria processed this. What does that mean for inbound traffic? Diversions, delays, cascading schedule disruptions. We have 62 confirmed attendees flying in this morning. Current estimate is that about 40% of them will see delays of 2 hours or more. 3 international flights are being diverted to Portland. She sat down on the edge of the hotel bed. Outside the window, the storm was still moving through, lighter now than it had been at 2 a.m., but still present. What about the next sky demo? A pause that told her the answer before the words did. The demo system is integrated with the SeaTac network infrastructure, Marcus said. We chose SeaTac specifically because the live integration was supposed to be the point, showing NextSky managing real airport data in real time. With the primary complex down and the network in its current state from the storm disruption, the integration is throwing errors. The demo won't run. She was quiet for a moment. Can we rebuild it to run on simulation data instead of live data? Our technical team is looking at that right now, but we're talking about reconfiguring the entire integration architecture in... She heard him check something. In about 28 hours. Who's on it? Dan Forrest's team. They've been on it since 3 a.m. Dan Forrest was Langford's chief technical officer, a careful and intelligent man who was excellent at managing known systems and significantly less comfortable with the kind of unstructured problem-solving that a 28-hour rebuild of a major software demonstration required. Victoria knew this about him. She'd hired him anyway because his management of known systems was genuinely excellent, and she'd always maintained her own separate understanding of where his limits were. I'm coming down to the operations room, she said. Victoria, it's 6 a.m. and I'm coming down to the operations room, she said again. She was dressed in 12 minutes. She made it to the airport operations center in 18, moving through the terminal corridors at the specific speed of a person who is not running but is not walking either. The speed that says, I know exactly where I'm going and I need to be there now. The operations center was a controlled version of chaos, the kind that experienced airport staff produced under pressure, where everything looked intense but nothing was actually disorganized. The shift supervisor, a compact woman named Renata, who had the specific quality of composure that only comes from having handled genuine crises rather than practicing for them, gave Victoria a 30-second briefing that was more useful than most people's 3-minute versions. Primary complex is down, secondary is operational, traffic is flowing at reduced capacity. We had an anomaly flag at 0420 from an external source, turned out to be accurate, caught the signal degradation before it could cause an approach incident. Medical transport was rerouted to Boeing Field, arrived safely. She paused. It was a good catch. The external tip, Victoria said. Who was it? Renata checked her log. Regional Maintenance Operation. Millhaven Aviation Services. The call came from Ray Walker. The analysis behind it came from... She scanned the notes. Someone named Ethan Walker. The name landed in Victoria Langford's chest with the particular weight of something that had been waiting a long time to arrive. She didn't react visibly. She'd spent 15 years developing the ability not to react visibly to things, which was professionally useful and personally costly in ways she hadn't fully audited. But something happened in the 3 seconds after she heard that name that she would have had difficulty describing to anyone who asked. A shift in internal weather, a pressure change, the feeling of a door opening in a room she'd kept closed for a very long time. Say that again, she said. Renata looked up from the log. Ethan Walker, Millhaven Aviation Services. The analysis of the localizer degradation pattern came from him. Victoria looked at the operations board. At the screens showing the current state of the airport. Flights holding, flights diverting. The slow recovery of a major hub working through the aftermath of a storm. At the notation in the operational log that said External Alert, ILS Anomaly, Verified and Actioned, Outcome, Approach Incident Averted. Where's he now? She asked. Renata blinked. He wasn't on site. He called in remotely, through Millhaven. Victoria turned away from the board and stood for a moment with her back to the room, facing the window that looked out over the tarmac where the secondary runway approach lights were cutting through the thinning storm in clean amber lines. Her reflection was faint in the glass. A 30-year-old woman who had run a billion-dollar company for the past decade, standing in an airport operations center at 6:15 in the morning with her heart doing something complicated. She'd thought about Ethan Walker twice last week. She thought about him with a frequency she'd never admitted to anyone.
Not obsessively, not in a way she'd have described as guilt exactly, though it had the shape of guilt in certain lights. More the way you think about a wound that closed wrong. The persistent awareness of something that hadn't healed correctly, in a place you couldn't quite reach.
She'd told herself in the first few years after the termination that she'd made the decision with the information she had, that the evidence in front of her had been conclusive, that her obligation as a CEO was to protect the company and act on the facts as presented, not on the instinct of a man who was naturally going to deny wrongdoing. She'd told herself this enough times that it had stopped feeling like rationalization and started feeling like history. But the name in Renata's log didn't care about the narrative she'd built around it. The name in the log was attached to a person who had, 15 years after she'd signed the order that ended his career, sat somewhere outside Seattle in the middle of a serious storm and read the behavior of a complex system with enough precision and expertise to catch something that had beaten every automated monitoring tool in the building. She pulled out her phone and called Marcus Chen. "I need the conference held to the afternoon session," she said when he picked up. "Not canceled, held. Tell the international delegates the storm created some logistical adjustments. Tell them we're honoring their travel time and we'll make it worth the wait." "Victoria, and I need a car to Mill Haven." A silence. "Mill Haven. The town. There's an aviation operation there, Mill Haven Aviation Services. I need to go today." Another silence, longer this time. Marcus was a smart man and he knew the outline of the Meridian story. Everyone at the company at a senior level knew some version of it. He'd been with the company for only 8 years, so his version was secondhand, filtered through the institutional memory that corporations develop around their own uncomfortable histories. But he knew enough. "Does this have to do with the name in the operations log?" he asked carefully. "Yes," she said. "And you want to do this today, day 1 of the summit." "I want to do this today," she said. Marcus exhaled. "The car will be downstairs in 30 minutes. She went back to her room to get her coat, and on the way she stopped in the corridor for a moment. Just stopped, standing in the empty hallway with the hotel's institutional carpet and the generic landscape prints on the walls. And she let herself feel, briefly and fully, the particular unpleasant sensation of a person who is about to do something she should have done years ago and knows it. She didn't allow herself to name what it was, not yet. But she stopped pretending it was just a professional courtesy call, which she'd been telling herself it might be for approximately the last 45 seconds since Renata had read that name from the log. The drive to Millhaven took 50 minutes in post-storm traffic, the highway still wet and the ditches running full with the storm drainage, the mountain ridgeline to the east beginning to show through the thinning clouds in patches of deep green and white. She sat in the back of the car and worked on her phone for the first 20 minutes, and then stopped pretending to work and just watched the landscape change, from urban corridor to suburb to the stretched rural miles that led eventually to the smaller towns east of the metro. She'd grown up in Seattle. She knew this drive in a general way, had done it for ski trips as a child, for a few college-era camping excursions she barely remembered, but she hadn't been out this way in years, and the distance felt longer and stranger than the miles explained. She thought about what she was going to say. She'd made significant speeches. She'd negotiated billion-dollar contracts. She'd walked into congressional hearings and ICAO meetings and rooms full of people who had been skeptical of her since before she opened her mouth, and she'd navigated all of them with a competence that had eventually become the thing people led with when they described her. She couldn't figure out how to start this conversation. "Hello, I destroyed your career and I've been carrying it for 15 years and someone just showed me your name in an operations log." "No. I've been looking into the Meridian situation and I think there may have been..." Also, no. Too careful, too corporate. The language of a liability assessment rather than a human being talking to another human being she'd wronged. She looked out the window. The mountains were becoming more present, the way they did once you got east of the metro, no longer a backdrop, but a presence. She'd forgotten how large they were when you got close. The car turned off the main highway onto a 2-lane road that the GPS identified as the route to Millhaven, and after another 10 minutes of fir trees and occasional farmland, the driver announced they were approaching the address. Millhaven Aviation Services was exactly what the name suggested, a working operation, not a corporate facility. A converted hangar with a concrete apron, Two small aircraft parked outside in the post-storm chill, a modest office building attached to the side. There was a sign above the hangar door that was weathered in a way that suggested it had been there long enough to have opinions about the weather. The parking area was gravel and held 3 vehicles, one of which was a truck that had clearly been driven hard through many Pacific Northwest winters. She got out of the car and stood for a moment in the parking lot with her coat pulled against the cold and the smell of the morning after a storm, wet earth and fur resin, and something mechanical from the hangar, and felt the profound difference between the world she'd come from and the world she'd arrived in. The hangar doors were open. She walked toward them. There were 2 men inside. The older one, in his late 60s, heavily built, with the hands of someone who'd spent a lifetime doing physical work, was reviewing something on a clipboard near a workbench along the wall. He saw her first, and his expression did something complex. Recognition, and something else, harder to name. The other man had his back to her. He was working on something inside an open access panel on the nose of a small aircraft, his attention completely on the problem in front of him. He was wearing a worn canvas jacket and work pants, and his hair was shorter than the photograph she'd dug up after seeing the name in the log, and he was thinner than she remembered, or maybe differently built. The kind of physical change that 15 years of physical rather than sedentary work produces in a person. The older man said something, quietly, just a few words, in a tone designed to carry to one person and not another. Ethan Walker straightened slowly. He turned around. She'd prepared herself for the moment, but it turned out preparation was not the right tool for it, because what she hadn't prepared for was that he looked exactly like what he was, a man who had rebuilt himself thoroughly and well, and who was looking at her now with an expression that was not rage, not bitterness, not the dramatic confrontation that the story seemed to require. He looked tired and calm, and unsurprised in a way that was somehow more confronting than any anger could have been. "Ms. Langford," he said. "Ethan." She stopped herself from adding a title because that would be wrong. That would be the armor of professional distance, and she hadn't driven 50 miles to hide behind professional distance. "I heard what you did this morning." "Ray made the call," Ethan said. "I just read the data. The operations log credits the analysis to you." He looked at her steadily. "What are you doing here?" It was a direct question, and it deserved a direct answer, and she had not come up with a clean version of a direct answer in 50 minutes of highway. So what came out was not the speech she'd been assembling, but something rawer than that, which was possibly more accurate. "I don't know exactly," she said. "I saw your name this morning, and I got in a car, which is—" She paused. "I know how that sounds. It sounds like you drove out here without knowing what you were going to say." "Yes," she said. "That's what it sounds like because that's what I did." Something shifted in his expression, not softening exactly, more like a reclassification, the face of a person updating his assessment of a situation based on new data. The older man, Ray, she understood, had set down his clipboard and was making his way toward the office door with the deliberate tactfulness of someone who has decided the room needs to be smaller. "Ray," Ethan said. Ray paused. "Stay," Ethan said. Ray stopped moving toward the door and stayed where he was, which was both tactful and practical. Ethan not entirely sure, even now, what shape this conversation was going to take or what it might require. Victoria looked at the hangar around her, the tools on the walls, the aircraft in various states of maintenance, the whiteboard near the workbench covered in diagrams she recognized as the specific language of someone who thought in systems. She looked at the coffee mug on the edge of the workbench that said, "World's Best Daddy" in paint that had faded, but not disappeared. She looked at Ethan. "I'm sorry," she said. The words came out cleaner than she expected. Not decorated, not qualified, just the thing itself. Ethan was quiet for a moment. "For which part?" "For signing that order without—" She stopped, started again. "For not looking harder, for trusting the paper in front of me instead of—" Another stop. "I've run it through my head enough times. I know what I did wrong." "Do you know what actually happened?" he said. "To the project. To the files." She met his eyes. "I have suspicions," she said carefully. "Suspicions I should have had 15 years ago." "Gerald Royce," Ethan said.
She didn't answer immediately. Not because she was surprised, she wasn't, not really, but because saying the name out loud in this context, in this hangar, was a different thing from thinking it privately in her office at 2 in the morning. I can't confirm or deny personnel matters outside. Ms. Langford. His voice was level. You drove 50 miles without knowing what you were going to say. I think we're past official language. She exhaled. Gerald Royce, she said. Yes, I believe so. He nodded. Once, the nod of a person who has known something for 15 years and is watching it finally get said by someone else. He's still with the company, she said. I know, Ethan said. He's Senior Vice President of Operations now. Something moved across Ethan's face. It wasn't surprise. It was the specific expression of a person encountering confirmation of something they'd understood in principle but hadn't fully felt until this moment. 15 years, he said quietly. Yes. The hangar was quiet except for the sound of the wind still moving outside, lighter now than it had been that morning, but still present, still insisting on itself. What happens now? Ethan said. It was a question she hadn't expected, and it told her something about him that she hadn't been sure of until this moment, that he wasn't interested in performing this moment for her benefit, wasn't going to let her emotional journey be the center of a story that was correctly understood about his losses and not her conscience. That depends on what you want, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, one of the aircraft on the apron shifted slightly in a gust, its tie-downs flexing against the wind, and the hangar's overhead lights buzzed faintly in a way that industrial lighting does when the building around it is taking weather pressure. I want the truth on record, he said. Not from me saying it, from the company acknowledging it. That's what I'm here about, she said. That's not what you said when you walked in, he said. You said you heard what I did this morning, and you got in a car. Both things are true. He held her gaze and she didn't look away, because looking away would have been a kind of dishonesty she was done with, in this conversation and in general. You have a conference, he said. I have a conference, she agreed, and a system that doesn't work. Something in his tone when he said that last part made her look at him differently. You know about Next Sky? Industry press isn't hard to read, he said. I've been reading it for 15 years. She watched his face. And the integration architecture they published in the technical preview, he said, has a fundamental problem with how it handles real-time rerouting under variable weather conditions, specifically in the Pacific Northwest corridor. The silence that followed that statement was a different quality from the silences before it. Victoria Langford was very still. How long have you known that? She said. Since the preview published, he said. 8 months ago. And you didn't? Who was I going to tell? His voice wasn't unkind, but it was precise. I don't work in the industry. I run a maintenance operation in Mill Haven. Who in that company was going to take a call from me? She didn't have an answer for that. Because he was right, and the rightness of it was attached to something she'd done 15 years ago, and the chain between those two facts was direct and clear, and not something she could look away from. Tell me about the problem, she said. He looked at her for a moment, assessing. Sit down, he said finally. Ray, is there more coffee? There is, Ray said from the workbench. Fair warning, it's been sitting since 6. That's fine, Victoria said, and sat down on the metal stool near the workbench without regard for what it might do to her coat, because some things turned out not to matter. Ethan picked up a marker and walked to the whiteboard and turned to face her, and she saw, in the set of his shoulders and the focus that came into his face, the engineer she'd met once in a conference room 15 years ago and failed completely to protect. The problem is in the handoff protocol, he said, and started drawing. He drew for 11 minutes without stopping. Victoria watched him work the whiteboard and understood somewhere in the first 3 minutes that she was watching someone who had never stopped thinking about this problem. Not the problem on the whiteboard specifically, the Next Sky integration architecture, the handoff protocol flaw he'd identified from a technical preview document 8 months ago, but the larger problem. The problem of systems that failed quietly, in ways that looked like green lights right up until the moment they didn't. The drawing was not neat. It was the working diagram of someone thinking out loud in a visual language,
arrows that got modified mid-stroke, labels added and then augmented with parenthetical clarifications, sections boxed and connected with lines that crossed each other in ways that would have looked chaotic to anyone who didn't already understand what they were looking at. Victoria understood enough of it to follow the argument being made, which told her two things: that the problem was real, and that it was specific in ways that suggested intimate familiarity with the underlying logic of the system. The handoff protocol assumes a clean sequential pass, Ethan said, underlining something near the center of the diagram. Weather event triggers rerouting request. The system generates a path modification. That modification gets handed off to the traffic management module, which executes. Clean, sequential, works perfectly under normal load. He drew a second branch below the first. But under variable weather conditions, especially in terrain-complex corridors, you don't get sequential events. You get simultaneous overlapping triggers. Multiple aircraft, multiple weather cells, multiple rerouting requests hitting the handoff layer at the same time. And the protocol can't handle the simultaneous load, Victoria said. It can handle the load. That's not the problem. He turned back to the board and added another element. The problem is the priority resolution. When multiple rerouting requests hit simultaneously, the protocol has to decide which one to process first. The priority algorithm it uses is based on flight phase, departure, cruise, approach, which makes sense as a first approximation. But in a Pacific Northwest weather event, you routinely have approach phase aircraft that are lower priority under the algorithm than cruise phase aircraft that are not actually time critical. And the result is that the system systematically deprioritizes the aircraft that most needs immediate rerouting guidance. The hangar was very quiet. Ray had set 2 cups of coffee on the edge of the workbench and then removed himself to the far end of the space with the practiced absence of a man who understood that the conversation in front of him needed room and didn't need a witness for every word. "How bad is the failure mode?" Victoria asked. "Under normal conditions, maybe never visible," Ethan said. "The algorithm produces a suboptimal sequence, but everything still gets processed fast enough that it doesn't matter. But under sustained high-traffic, high-weather event conditions, the kind you get at a hub like SeaTac during a serious Pacific system, the latency compounds. The approach phase aircraft waiting in the queue starts falling behind the guidance update cycle." He paused. "It wouldn't cause a crash. I want to be clear about that. The redundancies prevent that, but it would cause guidance gaps. Intervals where the system is technically operating but the rerouting information being provided is stale enough to be unreliable." "And the flight crew would see a normal display," Victoria said slowly. "The flight crew would see a normal display," he confirmed. "Because the system is operating, it's just operating on a priority sequence that isn't producing the right outputs fast enough." She sat with this for a moment. Outside the hangar, she could hear the last of the storm moving through. Lighter now, more rain than wind, the kind of weather that felt like an argument winding down. "You found this from the technical preview document," she said. "The preview had enough architectural detail to identify the structure of the handoff protocol," he said. "The priority algorithm was implied by the performance benchmarks they published. I ran the numbers." "In your spare time," she said. He looked at her. "It's not a hobby. It's what I do. I look at systems and find where they're going to fail. I've been doing it in this hangar for 15 years instead of in a corporate building because of what happened to Project Meridian, but the underlying work is the same." The thing he didn't say was loud in the space between the words. "This is what you lost access to. This is what the company lost access to for 15 years. She heard it anyway. "I need to ask you something," she said. "Go ahead." "Next Sky," she said. "The core architecture. The weather integration module specifically." She kept her voice even and professional and watched his face. "How familiar does it look to you?" The question landed where she intended it to. She watched him absorb it, watched the thing behind his eyes go still in the specific way of a person who has been carrying a knowledge they've never been able to use. "Familiar enough," he said. "How familiar?" He set the marker down on the whiteboard ledge. He turned to face her fully. "The weather integration logic in NextSky's core module is structurally identical to the Meridian weather integration protocol I developed 18 months before my termination. Not similar, not inspired by.
identical in its core architecture, with modifications in the surface implementation that would be consistent with someone who understood the logic but wasn't the person who originated it. Gerald Royce had access to the Meridian files, Victoria said. Gerald Royce had administrator access to every server the project touched, Ethan said. He approved my access credentials. He was the one who initiated the audit that flagged the anomalies. He was the one who presented the findings to you. I know, she said quietly. He built the case against me using files I'd created, Ethan said. He altered the diagnostic logs to make the algorithm look unstable. And then, after I was gone, he used the original work, the version he'd preserved before altering the audit copies, to build the system that eventually became Next Sky. It wasn't a question, it was a reconstruction, precise and detailed, delivered in the flat voice of someone who had worked through every step of it and arrived at certainty without needing anyone's confirmation. Victoria looked at the whiteboard, at the diagram Ethan had drawn, at the handoff protocol problem in the center of it, the flaw in a system that had been built on stolen architecture, a flaw that might never have existed if the person who originated the architecture had been the one to finish building it. I reopened the Meridian file 3 weeks ago, she said. He looked at her. After the Next Sky technical preview published, there was something in the preview that I noticed, an architectural choice that I didn't recognize from any of the development presentations our team had given me, something in the language of the logic that was different from how Dan Forrest's team typically thinks about problems. She paused. I went back to the original Meridian documentation, the pre-audit version that exists in our deep archive backup. I thought those backups were sealed, he said. They were. I unsealed them. She met his eyes. 3 weeks ago, at 2 a.m, in my office, I read the original Meridian project documentation for the first time. The actual documentation, the version that existed before Gerald's audit. The hangar was very quiet. And, Ethan said, one word, but she heard 15 years in it. The Meridian Weather Integration Protocol, she said, is not only the ancestor of Next Sky's core architecture, it is, in substantive technical terms, the same system, the same foundational logic, the same approach to the real-time data integration problem, the same priority framework, correctly implemented in the original, I should note. The flaw in Next Sky comes from what happens when someone who understands a system well enough to use it doesn't understand it well enough to extend it correctly. Ethan turned away from her. He walked to the hangar door and stood looking out at the wet apron, at the aircraft tied down in the post-storm quiet, at the mountains beginning to show themselves again as the cloud cover thinned at the eastern edge. His hands were in his pockets, and his shoulders were set in the particular way of a person containing something large. She didn't fill the silence. She'd filled enough silences in her career with words that were really just noise she made to avoid sitting in the discomfort of what she'd done. She was done with that. He stood at the door for about 2 minutes. She waited. When he turned back, his face had done something she hadn't expected. It had settled. Not into peace, not into satisfaction, but into the expression of a man who has been carrying a weight for a very long time and has just been told, for the first time by someone in a position to know, that the weight was always real, that he hadn't been wrong about what it was, that the thing he'd spent 15 years knowing without being able to prove had been true the whole time. "What does the investigation show?" he said. "The one you've been running for 3 weeks. I have a forensic audit firm working through the server logs from the original Meridian period. The technology firm is separate from our standard auditors, no connection to anyone who was involved in the original investigation." She kept her voice precise. They found evidence of file modification in the diagnostic audit logs consistent with a specific set of administrator credentials. The modification timestamps fall between 11 p.m. and midnight on a Tuesday in October, 15 years ago. She watched the recognition cross his face. "That's the window I identified," he said, "in the conference room, the day you fired me." "Yes," she said. "You identified it then. I didn't look." She said it plainly because it deserved to be said plainly, without the softening of corporate language or the structural hedging of legal caution. She had not looked. She had been presented with a clean case and a clean outcome, and she had taken both because taking them was easier than the alternative. And she had been 30 years old and running a $3 billion company, and scared in ways she hadn't fully admitted to herself at the time. None of that was his problem to manage. It was hers, and she owned it. The credentials used to modify the files, Ethan said, belonged to a service account that Gerald Royce created and administered, she said. The account was terminated 3 months after your departure. The termination request is in the system with Gerald's name on it. Ethan looked at her steadily. Is that enough? Combined with the architectural analysis showing the derivation of NextSky from the original Meridian documentation and the timeline of Gerald's involvement in both the audit and the subsequent development program, she paused. My legal team says it's enough. The forensic firm says it's enough. Whether it's enough for a full external legal proceeding depends on... I'm not interested in a legal proceeding, Ethan said. She stopped. I was interested in a legal proceeding 15 years ago, he said. I couldn't afford it then, in any sense of the word. Now, he glanced toward the far end of the hangar where Ray had found something industrious to do near the back workbench, and where, just visible through the office window, a framed photograph on the wall showed a girl of perhaps 11 or 12 laughing at something off camera. Now I'm interested in what's accurate being on record, in a way that lasts, in a way that means the next person who looks up the Meridian project doesn't find a story about an engineer who made a catastrophic error. That's what I want to give you, Victoria said. What does that look like from your end? She'd thought about this on the drive out. She'd thought about it for 3 weeks, in the honest hours when she wasn't managing the summit preparation, or the NextSky launch, or the 37 other things that constituted running a company of the size Langford Aviation had become. She'd thought about what was possible and what was right, and where those two things overlapped, and she'd built something in her head that she'd tested against her legal team and her own conscience, and had arrived at a version she thought was true to both. Public acknowledgement, she said. Through the company, through the conference, if you're willing, there's an audience there that represents the industry, and I think the industry should hear this from me directly, not from a press release. She kept her eyes on him. Full restoration of your professional record, attribution of the Meridian work, and the foundational architecture of NextSky to you as the originating engineer, financial compensation for the use of your intellectual property over 15 years. My legal team has drafted a number that I believe is appropriate, though I expect you'll want your own counsel to review it. And Gerald Royce, he said. Gerald Royce's employment with Langford Aviation will be terminated, she said, effective upon the completion of the internal investigation, which my board is being briefed on this afternoon. Ethan was quiet for a moment. 15 years, he said. He's been there 15 years since. Yes. While the system he built from my work was generating revenue for the company. Yes, she said again. She didn't qualify it. It was true, and it deserved to stand without qualification. He sat down on the stool across from her, the first time he'd sat since she arrived. He put his elbows on his knees and looked at the concrete floor for a moment, then back up at her, and she saw in his face the full weight of the thing. Not the anger, not the vindication, but the more complicated emotion that lives underneath both of those, the one that doesn't have a clean name. The feeling of a person who has been right about something terrible for a very long time and is now being told they were right, which is not the same as being made whole. I have a daughter, he said. She's 19. I know, She paused. I looked you up after the operations log. She was 4 when this happened, he said. She grew up in this town because I couldn't afford to fight, and I couldn't afford not to work, and fighting would have taken the work away. She grew up with one parent and a life that was smaller than it would have been, not because she was harmed by it. He stopped, seemed to recalibrate. She's extraordinary, but it wasn't a choice I made. It was a choice that was made for me. Victoria looked at him. She didn't say I'm sorry again because she'd already said it and saying it again wouldn't add anything, but she held what he was saying without deflecting from it, which was the most honest thing she could offer. There's something else, he said. Tell me. The NextSky flaw. He looked at the whiteboard. If the system deploys as currently architected, and if you have a sustained high-weather event at a major hub while the traffic load is at or above the system's tested threshold, you will see the priority resolution failure I described. Probably not on the first deployment, maybe not in the first year, but eventually. I know, she said,
which is why the summit demo isn't running, which is why Dan Forrest's team has been up since 3 a.m. trying to understand what's wrong. They won't find it by tomorrow, Ethan said. It's not a surface-level issue. The fix requires rethinking the priority algorithm from the ground up. She looked at him directly. Is that something you could do? The question sat between them for a moment. That depends, he said carefully, on what that conversation looks like. Whether it's a favor or whether it's a professional engagement. Whether it's me helping fix a problem in my own stolen work, or whether it's a professional engagement, she said, with terms, compensation, and full attribution. Your name on the technical documentation, your name in the conference materials, in the context I've already described. He looked at her for a long time, long enough that she wasn't sure which way it was going. I need to make a call, he said. He got up and walked toward the hangar office. Through the window, she could see him pick up his phone and dial, and then turn away from the window slightly. Not entirely, just enough to have the conversation without being fully visible, which she respected. She looked away and drank the cold coffee and looked at the whiteboard. From the back of the hangar, Ray materialized at her elbow with a steadiness that suggested he'd been waiting for an appropriate moment. You should know, Ray said quietly, not looking at her, looking at the whiteboard, that he never blamed you the way he blamed the other one. I want to be accurate about that. He was angry at you. He had every right to be. But the way he talked about it, when he talked about it, which was less than you'd think, it was always more like you'd made a mistake than like you'd done something he thought you were capable of knowing better than. She looked at the old man beside her. That's generous of him. It's accurate of him, Ray said. There's a difference. He picked up his clipboard. You did make a mistake, a bad one. But he always seemed to understand that Gerald Royce was the one who meant to do harm, and you were the one who got used. He walked away before she could respond to that, which was possibly intentional. Ethan came back from the office 5 minutes later. He didn't sit back down. He stood near the whiteboard and looked at it for a moment, and she saw him make a decision in real time, the specific set of the jaw and the particular exhale of a person closing one chapter in order to open another. My daughter is at the University of Washington, he said. Aerospace engineering, 2nd year. She hadn't known that. She followed you into it. She arrived there on her own, he said, which is different and better. A brief pause. I called her, she said, a small sound, not quite a laugh, something more complicated. She said to tell you the next sky priority algorithm has an obvious flaw and she'd been waiting for someone to fix it. Victoria stared at him. She read the technical preview, he said. She found the same problem I did, different angle, same conclusion. He shook his head slightly, with the expression of a father who has been quietly astonished by his child for 19 years and hasn't gotten used to it. She's something else. She sounds like it, Victoria said. I'll help with the fix, he said. Under the terms you described, I want them in writing before we go any further. Actual contract, reviewed by counsel I choose. Of course. And the public acknowledgement at the conference. I want to be present for it, not as a guest, as the engineer whose work is being attributed. That's exactly how I intend it, she said. He picked up the marker again. Then let me show you what the corrected algorithm looks like. The fix isn't as complicated as the problem. It never is. He turned back to the whiteboard and started drawing below the existing diagram. And this time the lines were different, cleaner, more assured. The drawing of someone building rather than dismantling. She watched him work and thought about what Ray had said. You did make a mistake, but he always seemed to understand that Gerald Royce was the one who meant to do harm, and you were the one who got used. She'd been used, yes. She'd been 30 years old and ambitious and slightly afraid, and someone had known exactly how to use those things against her. That was true. But it was also true that being used wasn't the same as being innocent, and the distinction mattered, and she'd spent a long time trying to blur it in her own accounting of what happened. She was done blurring it. Her phone had been buzzing in her pocket for the past 20 minutes. Marcus, almost certainly. The conference, the schedule adjustments, the 47 things that needed her attention before tomorrow. She pulled it out and looked at the screen. 9 missed calls. 4 from Marcus, 2 from her board chair, 1 from the FAA Regional Director's Office, 1 from a number she didn't recognize,
and one from Sandra Chen, who was still the company's general counsel and who Victoria realized was going to need to be on a call with her very soon. She typed a single text to Marcus. "I'll be back in 2 hours. Hold the afternoon session. Brief Sandra. Tell her the Meridian file is open and active. She'll understand." She put the phone back in her pocket without reading the rest. "The conference tomorrow," Ethan said, still working on the diagram. "What time?" "Opening session is at 9 a.m. I'd want you there by 8. I have to arrange for someone to cover the operation for the day." "Ray?" she suggested, from the back of the hangar without turning around. "I heard that, and yes, fine." Ethan's expression did the thing again. The almost laugh, the complicated affection of a man for the uncle who had been the fixed point of his adult life. 8 o'clock, he said. The 2 hours that followed were unlike any 2 hours Victoria Langford had spent in her professional life, which covered a considerable range. She sat on a metal stool in a working hangar 20 miles east of Seattle while Ethan Walker rebuilt the priority algorithm that sat at the center of the most important product her company had ever attempted to launch. Working on a whiteboard with a marker, talking through the logic and the direct, undecorated language of someone who had spent 15 years working with people who needed technical information to be immediately actionable rather than impressively framed. She asked questions when she had them. He answered them without condescension and without performance. When she pushed back on one element of the redesigned algorithm, a concern about how the corrected priority weighting would interact with the existing departure phase processing, he stopped, looked at what she was pointing at, and said, "You're right, that needs a secondary handler," and modified the diagram without any apparent difficulty in being corrected by her. That specific moment, the straightforward acknowledgement, the immediate adjustment, the complete absence of ego in the revision, told her more about who he was than anything else she'd observed in the 2 hours she'd been in his hangar. Around noon, Ray produced sandwiches from somewhere without explanation or comment and set them on the workbench. They ate while Ethan finished the whiteboard. Victoria ate standing up, looking at the completed diagram, running through the logic in her head and finding it clean in the way that genuinely well-designed systems are clean. Not simple, but without unnecessary complexity, without the architectural accumulation of compensating patches that systems developed by committee tend to develop. "This is going to require a significant rebuild of the integration layer," she said. 3 weeks? Maybe 4, with the right team, Ethan said. If they understand what they're rebuilding and why. If they're given the latitude to do it correctly rather than quickly. Dan Forrest's team? He looked at her. Is Dan Forrest's team going to be comfortable taking direction on the architectural changes from someone external? It was a fair question, and they both knew the answer was probably not entirely yes. "I'll handle Dan Forrest," she said. "There's another option," he said. "My daughter." She looked at him. "She's second year, so she doesn't have the professional standing to lead a rebuild," he said, working through it as he spoke. "But she found the same flaw I did, which means she understands the system well enough to contribute something real to the fix. And she's going to be an engineer in this industry for the next 40 years. Having her name attached to a significant architectural correction on a major deployed system." He paused. "That matters. The way having her father's name stripped off his own work mattered. In the other direction." Victoria was quiet for a moment. "I'd want to talk to her." "She'd want to talk to you," he said. "I can tell you right now that what she'd say first is that the secondary handler I just added needs a timeout parameter, or it creates a blocking condition under extreme load." Victoria looked at the diagram, at the secondary handler, at the place where, if Lily Walker was right, there was another gap. "She's already right," she said. "Yeah," Ethan said. "She usually is." He added the timeout parameter to the diagram. The whiteboard was almost full now. The original problem, the corrected algorithm, the secondary handler, the timeout parameter, 15 years of deferred work filling the available space in the systematic, practical handwriting of someone who thought in solutions. At 2 o'clock, Victoria's car arrived at the hangar entrance. The driver stood outside with the discretion of someone who had been professionally neutral about the last 5 hours and intended to remain so. She stood up from the stool, which had done things to her lower back that were going to require attention later. She picked up her coat. She looked at Ethan, who was photographing the whiteboard with his phone. Archiving the algorithm, she understood, preserving it before it could be altered or lost or attributed to someone else, which was a habit 15 years in the making and one she understood completely. "Tomorrow," she said. "Tomorrow," he said. She started toward the hangar door. She stopped. "The operations log from this morning," she said, without fully turning. "The notation about the ILS alert. They wrote external alert outcome. Approach incident averted. They're going to want to write it up properly, for the FAA record." "I know," he said. "Your name should be on that record." "My name is on the log," he said. "Renata wrote it down." "I mean officially, in a way that doesn't disappear." He was quiet for a moment behind her. She waited. "Okay," he said finally. She walked to the car. She got in. The driver pulled out of the gravel parking area and onto the two-lane road that led back to the highway, and she watched the hangar get smaller in the rear window until the road curved and the fir trees closed it off. She called Sandra Chen. Sandra answered on the first ring, which told her Sandra had been waiting. "I assume this is about the Meridian file," Sandra said. "The Meridian file, Gerald Royce, and a conference presentation I need to draft by 8 a.m. tomorrow," Victoria said. "Are you somewhere you can talk for the next 2 hours?" A brief pause. "Tell me everything," Sandra said. She told her everything. All of it. The technical preview 8 months ago that had nagged at her, the unsealing of the archive backup, the forensic audit, the service account with Gerald Royce's name on the modification timestamps, the architectural analysis showing the derivation of NextSky from Meridian, the conversation in the hangar, the whiteboard, the corrected algorithm, Lily Walker at the University of Washington, who had found the same flaw from a different angle and already identified a secondary issue that her father had just confirmed. Sandra was quiet for most of it in the manner of a lawyer who is simultaneously listening and processing implications. When Victoria finished, Sandra said, "You know Gerald is going to have counsel within the hour of being notified." "I know. And the board is going to want to understand the liability exposure before—" "The board is being briefed this afternoon," Victoria said. "The liability exposure from deploying a system built on stolen intellectual property over the past 8 years is significantly larger than the liability exposure from correcting the record now. My board is smart enough to understand that. Your board will also want to discuss the timing of the public acknowledgement at the conference relative to—" "Sandra," she kept her voice even. "I'm not asking the board's permission to acknowledge that the company used someone's work without attribution for 15 years. I'm telling the board what I'm going to do tomorrow and giving them the opportunity to be prepared for it." A pause. "Okay," Sandra said. "How do you want to structure the statement?" She thought about Ethan at the whiteboard, about the precision with which he'd identified the flaw in a system that had been built from his own architecture, the particular quality of a person who knows something so deeply that even its corrupted version is legible to them. "I want it in plain language," she said. "No legal hedging, no careful corporate framing that makes it sound like a policy review. I want it to be clear that a wrong was done, who did it, and what we're doing to correct it." "That's going to be uncomfortable for a lot of people in that room." "It should be," Victoria said. "Comfortable would mean I'm not actually saying it." The car reached the highway. The driver accelerated, the Cascades now behind them, and the Seattle skyline beginning its slow materialization on the western horizon. The towers, the sound, the geometry of a city that housed an industry that Ethan Walker had contributed to without credit for 15 years. She had a speech to write. She had a board call to get through. She had Gerald Royce to deal with, and Sandra's legal team to coordinate, and 200 international aviation delegates arriving tomorrow for a conference that was going to be something quite different from what any of them had anticipated. She had a daughter to call. Her own, 9 years old, in school right now probably. The one person in her life who had no agenda and asked no professional questions and just wanted to know if her mother was coming home for dinner. A question Victoria answered correctly, less often than she should. She pulled out her phone and scrolled past Marcus's missed calls to the contact that read simply, Emma, and called it. It rang 4 times, and then her daughter's voice, impatient and immediate in the way of 9-year-olds who have been sitting in school all day and have things to say. "Mom, finally." "Hey, Em," she said. "Are you coming home tonight?" She looked at the highway.
The work ahead was not small. Gerald Royce's termination alone would generate legal complexity that was going to run deep into the night. The conference statement had to be right in a way that was beyond merely legally sound. The technical documentation for the corrected algorithm needed to begin tonight if it was going to be ready to present tomorrow as something real rather than a promise. "Not for dinner," she said, "but I'll be there when you wake up. I promise." A brief silence. The considering silence of a child who has learned to evaluate her mother's promises against the evidence. "Okay," Emma said, and the small vote of trust in that single word landed with more weight than anything else had in a day that had contained considerable weight. "How was school?" "Fine. Boring. Mrs. Patterson assigned another project." "What kind of project?" "Famous scientists or engineers. We have to do a presentation." Victoria looked at the skyline approaching on the horizon, at the airport complex visible to the south, with its approach lights and its towers and its layered infrastructure of systems and protocols that kept thousands of people moving safely through the air. "Ask me again tonight," she said. "I might have someone to suggest." She hung up and opened her email and began drafting, and the car moved west through the aftermath of the storm toward a city that was still running on systems it didn't fully understand, built by people it hadn't fully credited, held up by the kind of invisible competence that only becomes visible when something goes wrong and the right person is in position to catch it. In the hangar behind her, Ray was closing up for the day. Ethan had driven home to make dinner. Lily's photograph still hung on the office wall. The 11-year-old with the streamers and the lopsided cake, laughing at something off camera, entirely unaware that she was growing up in the specific shape of someone who was going to matter to this industry in ways that neither the industry nor she yet fully understood. The whiteboard stood full in the empty hangar, the algorithm visible in the fading afternoon light through the high windows, the corrected logic, the clean solution, the work of a man who had spent 15 years being right in a place where nobody important could see it. Tomorrow, they would see it. Ethan didn't sleep well the night before the conference, which he hadn't expected and probably should have. He'd expected to feel resolved. The conversation in the hangar had been what it was, direct, difficult, necessary, and he'd made his decisions about it with the same methodical clarity he brought to technical problems. The terms were agreed. The contract language Sandra Chen's office had sent over at 9 p.m. was clean and specific in the ways it needed to be. His own attorney, a practical woman named Diane Hollis in Millhaven, who handled most of the region's commercial contracts and had reviewed the document with the focused skepticism of someone whose professional instinct was to find what was missing, had called him at 10:30 to say she was satisfied with the language and that he could sign. He'd signed. He'd put the phone down. He'd gone to bed. And then he'd lain in the dark of the cedar house and stared at the ceiling for 2 hours while the residual weather moved through outside. Not a storm anymore, just the trailing edge, occasional rain against the window glass, the firs doing their quiet settling in for the night sounds. And he'd thought about tomorrow in a way that wasn't quite anticipation and wasn't quite dread, but lived somewhere in the complicated territory between them. He thought about Gerald Royce. He'd found out at 9 p.m. through a text from Victoria that was 3 sentences long and purely factual. Gerald was notified at 6 p.m. He's retained counsel. His access credentials have been suspended pending formal termination. 3 sentences that represented the end of something that had been running for 15 years. A man comfortable in a position built on what he'd taken from someone else, and the machinery finally catching up to him. Ethan had sat with that information for a while. He'd expected to feel more. Satisfaction, maybe. Or the clean, bright feeling of vindication that the story seemed to require. What he actually felt was quieter and stranger than that. A kind of tiredness. The specific exhaustion of a person who has been waiting for something for a very long time and finds, when it arrives, that the waiting itself was the greater part of the experience, and the arrival is almost anticlimactic. He didn't hate Gerald Royce. He'd given up on hating him somewhere around year 4. Not for Gerald's benefit, but for his own, because hatred as a sustained practice requires energy that he'd decided to spend elsewhere. What he felt now was closer to contempt. Not the burning kind, but the cold, settled kind that doesn't require tending. The contempt of a person looking at someone who had sacrificed another man's career and 15 years of honest work for a position they hadn't been willing to earn, and who had spent those 15 years knowing exactly what they'd done. That was its own kind of sentence. Ethan had come to believe that over the years, though he couldn't have proven it and wouldn't have said it to anyone who'd interpret it as consolation. He got up at 5:15, made coffee, stood at the kitchen window in the pre-dawn dark and looked at the firs and the mountains behind them. Invisible still, just the shape of the dark, where the mountain dark sat differently from the sky dark. If you knew what you were looking at, he knew what he was looking at. He'd been looking at it for 15 years. He heard Lily's door open at 5:40, which was unusual. She was 19 and in her second year at UBA and home for the week. One of the irregular windows in the academic calendar that she'd used to come back to Millhaven since she'd left for college. Not because she was homesick exactly, but because she claimed the quality of sleep was better here and the coffee was worse everywhere else, which was her version of saying she missed it. She appeared in the kitchen doorway in an oversized sweatshirt and the specific expression of someone who had set an alarm for an unreasonable hour and was presently negotiating with herself about whether the reason had been sufficient. "You were awake," she said. Statement, not question. "I was awake," he confirmed. "I could hear you." She went to the coffee pot and poured with the proprietary ease of someone who had made coffee in this kitchen 4,000 times. "Walking around at 2. "I wasn't walking around at 2. "You were walking around at 2, she said flatly. "I heard the kitchen floor, third board from the window." He looked at her. She was right. He had been walking around at 2, briefly, when the lying still had gotten unproductive. The third board from the window did creak. He'd meant to fix it for approximately 6 years. "I'm fine," he said. "I know you're fine," she said. "I didn't say you weren't fine. I said you were walking around at 2. She leaned against the counter with her coffee and looked at him with the particular evaluative gaze of a person who had been reading her father's face since she was 4 years old and had gotten very good at it. "Are you nervous about today?" "I don't get nervous about presentations." "This isn't a presentation. This is different." He looked at his coffee. "Yeah," he said, "it's different." She was quiet for a moment, and he was grateful for the quiet, for the fact that she'd become, over the years, a person who knew when to push and when to let something sit. She'd gotten that from him, which was one of the things he felt most straightforwardly good about. "She called me yesterday," Lily said. "Victoria Langford." He looked up. "When?" "Around 6. She got my number from the faculty directory, I think, or maybe from you. She didn't say. She wanted to talk about the timeout parameter." A pause. "We ended up talking for an hour." "About the algorithm?" "About the algorithm for maybe 20 minutes, Lily said, and then about other things." He waited. "She told me about the conference today. What she's planning to say." Lily looked at her coffee mug. The same mug, replaced twice over the years because the original had finally broken, but always the same world's best daddy in the crooked painted letters of her 5-year-old self, because she'd made him a new one each time with the same design, a continuity that she'd never explained but that he understood completely. She wanted to ask if I was okay with how she planned to reference you. And I told her that was a question for you, not me. She looked at him directly. But she also told me that she knew what it had cost. Not just professionally. She said she knew about the time, the years. He didn't say anything. "I think she meant it," Lily said, "which doesn't fix anything, but I thought you should know." He nodded, looked out the window at the lightening sky. "You don't have to come today if you don't want to." "Dad," the single syllable carrying the full weight of her opinion on that suggestion. "I mean it. This is my thing to deal with. You don't—" "I found the same flaw in that system that you found," she said. "My name is going on the technical attribution alongside yours. I'm coming." She set her mug down. "Also, I want to see Gerald Royce's name removed from the building plaque in the lobby, which apparently is happening this morning, and I've decided I want to witness that in person." He looked at her for a moment. "There's a building plaque?" "Innovation Wing," she said. "Gerald Royce Innovation Center. Apparently he lobbied for it 6 years ago and nobody stopped him." A pause. "It's coming down at 7 a.m. Something moved through him at that. Not satisfaction exactly, but something adjacent to it. The specific feeling of a corrective that is long overdue being finally applied. I would also like to witness that, he said. They drove to Seattle together in the early morning, Lily in the passenger seat with her laptop open and the algorithm documentation they'd been refining since 5 a.m. pulled up on the screen. She talked through the timeout parameter modifications while he drove, and he responded, and it was the most natural conversation in the world. Two engineers working a problem, one of whom happened to be the other's daughter, both of whom happened to be doing it at 6:15 in the morning on the way to the most significant day either of them had faced in a long time. He didn't say that. She probably knew it. Some things didn't need to be said out loud between people who had learned each other as thoroughly as they had. The conference center attached to SeaTac's main terminal was a different world from the hangar in Millhaven. High ceilings, climate-controlled air, the specific aesthetic of spaces designed to impress international guests. It was also, at 7:15 in the morning on the day of the summit, a controlled version of organized chaos. AV teams running cable, catering staff managing the breakfast setup, early arrivals from the international delegations navigating the space with the slightly jet-lagged purposefulness of people who had traveled significant distances and intended to get something out of it. Victoria met them in the lobby. She was already in conference mode, the composed, forward-moving quality of a person who had done whatever internal processing she was going to do and had now committed fully to what came next. She was wearing a dark blazer and looked like she'd slept approximately as well as Ethan had, which was to say not particularly, but she was carrying it the way she carried most things, without making it anyone else's problem. She looked at Lily first, and Ethan watched the moment, the two of them meeting for the first time. The woman who had signed the order and the child who had grown up in its aftermath, both of them standing in a hotel lobby at 7:15 a.m. with the polite, slightly formal energy of people who have had a significant phone conversation about an aviation algorithm and are now calibrating what that translates to in person. "Lily," Victoria said. "Ms. Langford," Lily said. A brief pause. Then Lily said, "The timeout parameter I added, I ran it against the extreme load simulation last night. It holds. But there's a boundary condition at the upper edge of the traffic threshold where the handler and the timeout interact in a way that creates a 2-second latency spike." Victoria looked at her. 2 seconds. Under extreme load only, still within safety parameters, but it should be addressed in the rebuild. "Can you document it?" "Already have," Lily said, and held up her laptop. Something shifted in Victoria's face, the specific expression of a person encountering confirmation of something they'd hoped was true but had reserved judgment on. "Come on," Victoria said. "I want to show you both something before the session starts." The Gerald Royce Innovation Center, which was what the small plaque beside the entrance to the East Wing still read, at 7:22 a.m., was in the process of being denamed with the brisk efficiency of a facilities team that had received very clear instructions and was executing them without commentary. Two maintenance workers were removing the plaque when they arrived. The wall behind it was a slightly different shade from the surrounding paint, the pale ghost of where the plaque had been, visible in the way that removed things always leave their outline. Ethan stood in the corridor and watched it come off the wall. It was a small thing, physically. A rectangle of brushed aluminum, tasteful, institutional, the kind of thing you walked past 100 times without looking at. The weight of it was not in the object. The maintenance worker set it on a cart, looked up and saw Ethan watching. "You want it?" he asked, the pragmatic question of a person who has been told to remove something and is now uncertain about its disposition. "No," Ethan said. The worker put it on the cart and covered it with a cloth and wheeled it away. And the corridor was just a corridor again, with a wall that needed touching up and nothing on it. Lily stood beside him. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. They stood there for about 15 seconds, and then they walked back toward the conference hall, and that was enough. The Global Aviation Infrastructure Summit opened at 9 a.m. with a room of 212 people, industry executives, government representatives, airline operations directors, technical leaders from 30 countries, and the aviation press. The morning program had been restructured from what the advanced materials described. The Next Sky demonstration
had been replaced with what the revised agenda described simply as technical briefing and industry address by CEO Victoria Langford. The room had the focused, slightly expectant quality of a professional audience that has noticed a program change and is wondering what it means. Victoria stood at the podium and looked at the room for a moment before she began. Ethan was seated in the second row, not the front, his specific request, the practical preference of a man who had spent 15 years not being in the front of rooms, with Lily beside him and Ray, who had driven down that morning because Lily had called him and described what was happening, and Ray had said, "I'll be there at 8, with the uncomplicated certainty of a man who understood that some things required witness. "I'm going to start this morning differently than planned," Victoria said. "I'm going to tell you a story about something this company did wrong, and then I'm going to tell you what we're doing to correct it."
I'm not going to read from prepared remarks because I've found, when I've tried to do that this week, that the prepared remarks make it sound more manageable than it was. The room was very still. 15 years ago, this company terminated an engineer named Ethan Walker on the basis of evidence that had been deliberately fabricated by one of our senior executives. The fabrication was designed to conceal the theft of Mr. Walker's intellectual property and to redirect blame for a system anomaly that had been manufactured specifically to create grounds for termination. The executive in question subsequently used Mr. Walker's work, specifically the foundational architecture of what became our Meridian project, and later the core logic of our NextSky system, as the basis for his own advancement within this company. She paused. The room was quiet in the way that rooms get quiet when something is being said that nobody expected and everyone is recalibrating. "I signed the termination order," she said. "I want to be clear about that. Gerald Royce built the case, and the case was fraudulent, but I signed it without looking hard enough at what I was being shown. I was 30 years old, and I was running a company I was still learning to run, and someone I trusted handed me a clean story, and I took it. That is not a defense. It's an explanation. There's a difference." In the second row, Ray exhaled slowly. Lily was completely still beside Ethan, her eyes on the podium, her face doing something careful and controlled that looked like the face Ethan made when he was containing something significant. Ethan Walker spent the following 15 years rebuilding his life outside this industry, in a small town near the Cascades, doing the work that skilled engineers do when the corporate world is no longer available to them. He continued thinking about aviation systems. He continued solving problems. And yesterday morning, during the storm that most of you flew through to get here, he identified a signal degradation in SeaTac's ILS infrastructure that our own monitoring systems had not flagged, and he called it in time to prevent what the operations report describes as a potential approach incident. She looked at the room. A medical transport carrying a pediatric organ was among the traffic affected. It was rerouted safely. I want you to understand what I mean when I say that the man this company discarded 15 years ago spent yesterday morning protecting the infrastructure that the rest of us depend on. The silence in the room had a different quality now, denser, more uncomfortable in the specific way of professional discomfort. The recognition by an industry of its own systems failing in ways that implicated everyone in the room, not just the company at the podium. Gerald Royce's employment with Langford Aviation was terminated yesterday evening, Victoria continued. The internal investigation that established the facts I've described is being provided to the FAA and to our board. The forensic documentation, server logs, modification timestamps, architectural analysis will be available to the press following this session. She picked up a document from the podium and held it briefly so the room could see it, then set it down. Effective today, Project Meridian is being officially attributed to its originating engineer, Ethan Walker. The foundational architecture of the NextSky system is similarly attributed to Mr. Walker's original Meridian work. A formal agreement recognizing his intellectual property rights, including compensation for 15 years of commercial use, has been executed. She paused. Additionally, an architectural flaw in NextSky's priority resolution protocol, independently identified by Mr. Walker and by his daughter Lily Walker, currently a second-year aerospace engineering student at the University of Washington, has been documented and a corrected algorithm has been developed. The corrected algorithm will be the basis for NextSky's rebuild before any deployment. Both Walkers are credited as contributors to that correction. She looked directly at the second row. Not performatively, not in the way of a speech making a theatrical gesture, but with the direct attention of a person acknowledging another person. "Mr. Walker is here this morning," she said. "I asked him to say a few words. He agreed, with the condition that I not introduce him as a guest. He's here as the engineer whose work this conference has been built on, and I think that's exactly right." Ethan stood up. He hadn't prepared remarks in the conventional sense. He'd thought, on the drive in, about what he wanted to say, and what he'd arrived at was not a speech, but a few things he thought were true and worth saying to a room full of people who worked in the industry he'd been removed from. He walked to the podium. Victoria stepped back. He adjusted the microphone because she was taller than him, which was a mundane physical detail that, for some reason, made the room feel more real, more like an actual thing that was actually happening rather than the version of it that lived in his head for 15 years under various imagined forms. He looked at the room. "I'm not going to talk about what happened to me for very long," he said, "because what happened to me is less interesting than what it means for how this industry operates. And I'm going to say something that will make some of you uncomfortable, which I think is probably appropriate." He could feel Lily in the second row without looking at her. He could feel Ray. He looked at the room instead. "Aviation is an industry that talks a lot about safety culture," he said, "about the importance of reporting errors, about non-punitive environments, about systemic thinking over individual blame. Those are good values. The problem is that those values apply differently depending on where you are in the hierarchy. The safety culture in a cockpit is different from the safety culture in a boardroom. And what happened with the Meridian project 15 years ago, what happened to me, was not an anomaly. It was what happens when organizational incentives protect the powerful at the expense of the accurate." He looked at the press section, at the international delegates, at the faces of people who ran airlines and operations programs and technical departments, and who understood, at a professional level, exactly what he was describing. "I'm not here to indict this company specifically," he said. "Victoria Langford made a mistake, and she's standing here correcting it, which is more than most people do. I'm here because the mistake was possible, and it was possible in a specific way that should matter to everyone in this room. The person who destroyed my career did it using the tools of administrative authority, access credentials, audit processes, the structural power that comes with seniority. He didn't need to be smarter than me. He just needed to be in a position where his version of events was treated as more credible than mine by default." He paused. "I want to say something about my daughter," he said, and his voice changed slightly. Not breaking, but shifting into a different register. The register of a person moving from professional to personal and being honest about the transition. "She's 19, she's in this room right now, and she found the same flaw in the Next Sky system that I found, independently, from a different analytical angle. She's going to be in this industry for the next 40 years. And what I want for her, what I want for every young engineer who comes into this field, is that the story of what happened to me stays known, not as an inspiring comeback story, not as a cautionary tale about bad people, as a structural lesson about what happens when the systems we use to evaluate technical truth are vulnerable to the people who control them." He looked at the second row, at Lily, who was looking at him with an expression that was not quite composed, who had the face of a person trying to hold something together that was pushing back. "She's going to be fine," he said. "She's already better at this than I was at her age, which I find alternately gratifying and mildly threatening." A brief pause. One person in the room laughed, a real laugh, not polite. It loosened something. "She grew up in a small town near the Cascades because that was where I could give her the most of myself under the circumstances. And I would make that choice again, without hesitation. But I'd rather the choice hadn't been forced." He looked back at the full room. "Fix your systems," he said. "Not just the technical ones, the human ones. The ones that decide whose account of a problem gets treated as credible. That's the work that matters. The technical problems are solvable. The human problems are where we keep failing." He stepped back from the podium. The applause started from somewhere in the middle of the room, not immediately, not the automatic response of a crowd performing approval, but the delayed, genuine applause of a room that had needed a second to absorb what it had just heard. It built. He walked back to his seat. Lily grabbed his arm when he sat down. Not dramatically, just her hand on his forearm for a moment, The physical vocabulary of a daughter saying something she wasn't going to put into words in a room full of 200 people. He put his hand over hers briefly, and then the moment passed, and they were just sitting in the second row while the room continued to process the morning. Ray was looking at the ceiling, which was his way of not letting his face show what it was doing. The rest of the morning session covered the technical briefing, the next sky flaw, the corrected algorithm, the rebuild timeline. Dan Forrest presented the technical details, competently and without any apparent difficulty, attributing the corrected architecture to Ethan and Lily, which Victoria had clearly had a direct conversation with him about before the session. Lily was invited to the podium for the presentation of the timeout parameter correction, and she stood there and explained it in the clean, practical language of an engineer who knows what she's talking about and has decided that the clearest path to being understood is also the most direct one, which was her father's influence rendered in her own idiom. The press questions afterward were thorough and pointed in the way of aviation industry journalists who cover regulatory and safety issues and understood exactly what the morning's announcements meant for the industry's self-regulatory frameworks. Victoria answered all of them directly, including the ones that were uncomfortable, including the one from a journalist who asked whether the 15-year delay in surfacing this information represented a failure of the company's ethics reporting mechanisms, to which Victoria said, "Yes, it does. And addressing those mechanisms is part of what we're doing going forward, without any of the hedging that would have made the answer less honest." Gerald Royce's attorney issued a statement during the lunch break that described the allegations as without merit and promised a vigorous defense of his client's reputation. The statement was carried by the trade press, and most of them appended it to their coverage of the morning's conference without apparent belief in its conclusion, which was the most honest coverage of a legal defense statement that Ethan had ever seen. He and Lily ate lunch in a corner of the conference center cafe, away from the main dining area where the delegates were networking. Ray sat with them and ate a sandwich and didn't say much, which was his mode in environments that felt foreign to him, and which Ethan had always found deeply comforting. "How do you feel?" Lily asked him. "I don't know yet," he said honestly. "That's fair. I thought I'd feel more," he said. "Or different. I'm not sure what I expected." Lily looked at her coffee. "I think when you wait a long time for something, the thing itself doesn't hit the same as the waiting did, because the waiting was real time, years of real time, and the thing is just—" She gestured vaguely. "A morning." He looked at her. "When did you get this wise?" "I've always been this wise," she said. "You just couldn't see it because you're biased." "I'm not biased." "You're profoundly biased," she said. "You think everything I do is extraordinary. I got a B- on a heat transfer problem set in October, and you told me it showed character." It did show character. "Dad?" Ray made a sound that was not quite a laugh. It was close enough. Victoria found them there, at the corner table just after 1 o'clock. She came over without the conference energy, not the composed CEO from the podium, but a person between the roles, still carrying the weight of the morning. "Can I sit?" she said. Ethan pulled out the chair across from him. She sat. She looked tired in a way she wasn't managing as carefully as she had been earlier, and he recognized it. The specific exhaustion of a person who has been carrying something for a very long time and has now put it down, and the putting down turns out to be its own kind of demanding. "The press coverage is going the way I expected," she said. "Most of the trade outlets are running it straight. 2 of the major papers want follow-up interviews." "With me?" he said. "With you and with me, and they want to know if Lily would be willing to speak to the engineering angle." She looked at Lily. "No pressure." "I'll do it," Lily said. "You don't have to—" "I said I'll do it. Direct. No negotiation." Her father's daughter. Victoria almost smiled. "Okay." She looked at Ethan. "There's something else." "Tell me." The FAA Regional Director's Office called this morning. They want to formally recognize the ILS alert, the notification and the analysis that led to it. They're proposing a commendation, not a big ceremony, just an official recognition in the record. He started to deflect and then stopped, because deflecting was a habit he'd built in the years when visibility had felt dangerous, and the years when visibility was dangerous were over. "Okay," he said.
The operations team at SeaTac also wants to put something in their facility records. The notification chain from yesterday morning. Your name on the documented outcome. She paused. I want to make sure you're comfortable with all of it. I'm comfortable with it, he said. She nodded, looked at her hands on the table for a moment, then back at him. I know today doesn't fix the 15 years, she said. I want to be clear that I know that. I know you know that, he said. Is there anything else you need from me? From the company? She asked it like she meant it, not as a formality, not as a closing of a transaction, but as a genuine and somewhat uncertain question from a person who understands that some damage doesn't have an adequate repair. He thought about it, really thought about it, not as a performance of consideration, but as an actual question worth actually answering. The contract covers what it covers, he said. The record is being corrected. The attribution is on paper. He paused. My daughter has her name on a technical correction to a major aviation system, and she's 19 years old. He stopped. That's not nothing. It's not nothing, Victoria agreed. I think what I needed, he said slowly, was for someone in a position to know to say out loud that it happened. That the thing I knew was true was actually true. And that it wasn't just the story I told myself to make the loss bearable. He looked at her. You did that this morning, in a room with 200 people and the aviation press. He paused. That's what I needed. She held his gaze and didn't say anything for a moment, just sat with it, the way she'd sat with difficult things all morning without reaching for the language that would make them easier. For what it's worth, she said finally, I should have looked harder 15 years ago. Not because Gerald's case wasn't convincing, it was. Because you told me in that conference room that the timestamps were wrong, and I didn't look at the timestamps, and I think part of me knew, even then, that I was taking the easier path. Yeah, he said. I know. I've thought about that for a long time. I know that too, he said. I could see it on your face, even then. She was quiet. It doesn't make you a bad person, he said. I want to be accurate about that, the way Ray was accurate with me about some things. You made a mistake under pressure, and you were used by someone who was better at being dishonest than you were at detecting it. That's a real distinction. It doesn't feel like much of a defense, she said. It's not a defense, he said. It's just what's true. And being accurate matters more to me than the narrative that makes this cleaner. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he recognized now. The same expression she'd had in the conference room 15 years ago, in the 3 seconds before she picked up the pen, the one he'd read as uncertainty even then. Except now it wasn't about a decision still ahead. It was about the distance between who she'd been and who she was trying to be, and the particular human difficulty of never quite closing that gap entirely. I have a daughter, she said. She's 9. He waited. She asked me last night for a subject for a school project, Victoria said. Famous scientists or engineers. I told her to ask me again tonight and I'd have a suggestion. She paused. I'd like to tell her about the Meridian project, about who built it, if that's all right. He looked at her for a long moment. Lily, across the table, was looking at her coffee and very carefully not inserting herself into the space between them. Yeah, he said. That's all right. The afternoon session ran until 4 o'clock. Ethan sat through parts of it and stepped out for others, moving through the conference center at the unhurried pace of someone who is where he is supposed to be and doesn't need to perform that fact. He talked to 2 of the international delegates who sought him out specifically. One, an operations director from a Scandinavian carrier, who wanted to discuss the ILS degradation detection methodology and had specific questions about the signal variance pattern that told Ethan he was talking to someone who genuinely understood what had happened. The other, a young engineer from a Southeast Asian aviation authority who had recognized Lily from the morning session and introduced herself and then turned to Ethan and said, with the directness of someone who had decided politeness was secondary to the question she actually had, your original Meridian architecture, was the core weather integration logic derived from anything published before 2010, or was it entirely original? To which Ethan had said entirely original, and the young woman had said, that's what I thought, in a tone that suggested she had already run the analysis and arrived at a conclusion she'd wanted confirmed. He found Ray at the window near the terminal gate area late in the afternoon,
looking out at the tarmac where the post-storm operations were running their normal rhythm, aircraft moving, jetways engaged and disengaged. The visible machinery of an airport functioning as airports are supposed to function. "You doing okay?" Ray said. "Yeah," Ethan said. "Tired. Good tired or bad tired?" He thought about it. "Both. Mostly good." Ray nodded. They stood at the window for a while. An aircraft pushed back from the gate directly in front of them, a wide body, beginning its long route to somewhere far from Seattle, the ground crew walking clear in their high-visibility vests as the tug released and the aircraft began its own slow momentum toward the taxiway. "Your dad would have wanted to see this," Ray said. For the second time in 15 years, he'd said something about his father unprompted. Ethan didn't respond to it the way he had the first time, not with the careful non-engagement of a person who doesn't know how to receive the gift. He just stood with it for a moment, let it land where it landed, and said, "Yeah, he would have." That was enough. The conference wound down at 5. The delegates moved toward the terminal for their flights home, the specific post-conference dispersal of 200 people who have absorbed a significant amount of information and are now processing it at altitude over their respective continents. The press had filed their stories. The FAA notification had been formalized. The documentation package that Sandra Chen's office had prepared was in the hands of the right people. Victoria found Ethan near the exit at 5:40. "The contract has been executed on our end," she said. "Diane Hollis has the countersigned copies." "She messaged me," he said. "The attribution documentation will be updated across all published materials by end of business Friday." She paused. "Dan Forrest's team starts the rebuild Monday. I'd like weekly touch points with you during the rebuild, if you're willing." "I'm willing," he said. "Video calls work. I'm not moving to Seattle." "I didn't expect you to," she said. They stood near the exit for a moment. The terminal was busy around them. The ordinary continuous business of an airport, people moving toward gates and away from them, the flow that didn't pause for summits or corrections or 15-year reckonings. It just kept moving, because that was what it did, because that was what airports were for. "Gate 27, Lily said, appearing at Ethan's elbow with her bag and Ray behind her. She looked at her phone. "Our flight's at 6:40. We should go." "You're flying," Victoria said. "Ray's covering the hangar tomorrow," Ethan said. "We got an evening flight back." He glanced at Lily. "Her idea." "It's faster," Lily said. "And you've been flying commercial your whole career, and you never just fly. As a passenger, you always drive." "I drive because I like to drive." "You drive because you think about aircraft maintenance when you're in a passenger seat, and it stresses you out," she said, "which is honestly a very specific way to spend a flight. And I thought today of all days you could maybe just sit and look out the window." He looked at her. She looked back at him with the serene confidence of someone who has made a decision on another person's behalf and is not second-guessing it. "Gate 27, he said. They walked toward the security checkpoint. Ethan and Lily and Ray, who had driven 3 hours to witness a morning and was now apparently taking an evening flight home rather than driving back because Lily had also arranged this without announcing it, which was a level of logistical management that he found both impressive and slightly alarming. Victoria walked with them as far as the checkpoint entrance. At the point where the public area ended and the secure side began, she stopped. "Safe flight," she said. Ethan looked at her. He thought about 15 years. About the October morning, the cardboard box, the coffee mug, the elevator. About the cedar house and the mountains and the whiteboard in Ray's hangar and the photograph of Lily at 11 with the lopsided birthday cake. About the girl in the bumblebee costume who had become the engineer at the podium. About a Tuesday night in February of the second year when he'd sat at the kitchen table and understood he was alone in the specific way that teaches you what you actually need. About the morning of the storm, sitting in Ray's office with the raw data in front of him and the quiet certainty of a man who has spent 15 years looking at systems and knowing where they fail. "Take care of your daughter," he said. She looked briefly startled, not by the content but by the directness, the pivot from professional conclusion to personal. Then something in her face settled into something genuine. "I'm trying," she said. "I'm going to try harder." "That's enough," he said. "That's all it ever is." He turned and went through security. Gate 27 was a 40-minute walk from the checkpoint, which was the standard SeaTac phenomenon of gates that are technically in the same terminal and practically in a different zip code. They walked it without hurry. Ethan and Lily and Ray, the three of them moving through the busy corridor past coffee shops and newsstands and the particular compression of human activity that airports produce when everything is in motion at once. Lily bought a coffee she didn't need. Ray bought a newspaper with the specific satisfaction of someone who prefers print. Ethan walked and looked at the planes visible through the terminal windows. The evening light catching the fuselages at angles that made them look almost architectural, the way aircraft look from the terminal side, stripped of their context of motion and functioning more as objects than as machines. He'd always loved that view, the stationary aircraft from the terminal window, the held breath moment before movement, the enormous, useful fact of them. They reached Gate 27 with 20 minutes to spare. The gate area was moderately full, a mix of business travelers and families, and a group of college students who had the specific energy of people returning from something worth returning from. The departure board showed their flight on time. Lily sat down and opened her laptop immediately because she was incapable of being in an airport for 20 minutes without doing something productive, which was another thing that was his fault and which he had no genuine remorse about. Ray sat down and opened his newspaper and was immediately and completely occupied with it, in the way of men who have always been able to remove themselves from ambient anxiety by finding something concrete to read. Ethan sat between them and looked out the window at the aircraft that was being prepared for their flight. The ground crew working through their checklist, the fueling operation in its final stage, the careful and systematic preparation of a machine that was about to carry 140 people through the air at 35,000 feet and bring them down intact on the other side. He looked at it the way he'd always looked at aircraft, not with the fear that civilians sometimes expected, knowing what he knew about what could go wrong, but with the particular appreciation of someone who understands what it costs. The engineering, the maintenance, the accumulated expertise of thousands of people, to make flight routine, to make it something you just get on and do. He thought about the pediatric heart transport that had arrived safely at Seattle General yesterday morning. A child somewhere in the city today who was alive because a chain of decisions, an alert made at the right moment, a call taken seriously, a rerouting executed correctly, had held. He would never know that child's name. The child would never know his. The chain between them was invisible, the way most of the chains that hold the world together are invisible. The maintenance done correctly, the system monitored honestly, the error reported rather than covered, the quiet competence that only surfaces in the record when something goes right rather than wrong. That was the work. That had always been the work. The boarding announcement came over the PA. Lily closed her laptop. Ray folded his newspaper with the efficiency of a man who has folded many newspapers. They stood and joined the line and moved toward the gate, and Ethan handed over his boarding pass and walked down the jetway and found his seat, window seat, because Lily had booked it that way, and settled in. Through the window, the tarmac was moving into evening light. The sun was down behind the Olympics to the west, and the sky was doing the thing Pacific Northwest skies do in the hour after sunset, layering itself in shades of blue and gray and the specific muted rose that doesn't quite have a name. The sky of a region that takes its weather seriously and its beauty quietly. The aircraft pushed back. The engines spooled up with the sound that Ethan had never been able to fully hear as background noise, always attended to it with the automatic attention of someone whose professional life had been spent understanding what those sounds meant and didn't mean. They meant right now that everything was working as it should. Lily, in the middle seat, had her head tilted slightly toward his window, not looking at her phone for once, just looking at the airport receding below them as the aircraft climbed, at the lights coming on across the city as the evening settled in, at the sound catching the last of the sky's color. "Dad?" she said. "Yeah." "You okay?" He looked out the window. At the city below, at the airport complex, already small and coherent from altitude, the geometry of it visible in a way it never was from the ground, the runways, the terminal, the approach lighting beginning to activate in the dusk. Gate 27 was too small to see from here. It was just part of the pattern, part of the structure of the thing. "Yeah," he said. "I think I actually am." She leaned her head briefly against his shoulder. The old gesture, the one she'd been doing since she was 4 years old, and had simply scaled it to her current size without ever dropping it, which was one of the things he would carry with him without difficulty for the rest of his life. The aircraft banked east. The mountains came into view, the Cascades, enormous and clear in the fading light, the snow on the high peaks catching the last of the sun in shades of amber and rose. Lily lifted her head and looked at them. "Are those our mountains?" she said. She was saying it the way she'd said it the first time, at 4 years old on the porch railing in Millhaven, with full knowledge that she was repeating it, the specific callback of a person who has kept track of the small things. He looked at the mountains. At the peaks he'd driven toward for 15 years, that had been the fixed point on the horizon during every version of the life he'd built in their shadow. The mountains that had looked down on every morning he'd gotten up and chosen his daughter over his damage. Every evening he'd sat on the porch and run the numbers on what he had left. The mountains that had watched him, patiently and without opinion, become the person he was today, which was a person whose name was now in the official record where it had always belonged. "Yeah," he said, "those are ours." The aircraft climbed. The mountains fell below the cloud line. The sky opened up above them into the clean, enormous dark where the stars were beginning to show themselves, not as backdrop, not as atmosphere, but as the actual things they were. Old light arrived at last, crossing distances that made human difficulties look small without making them meaningless. Ray was already asleep in the aisle seat, which was either the sleep of a man at peace or the sleep of a man who had been awake since 4 a.m. and had run out of runway. Probably both. Ethan closed his eyes. He didn't think about Gerald Royce. He didn't think about the contract or the conference or the coverage that would run in the morning. He didn't think about the rebuild of the Next Sky architecture or the FAA commendation or the 9-year-old girl named Emma who would be told tomorrow about a man named Ethan Walker and a project called Meridian. He thought about a 4-year-old in a living room who had once asked him to be the dragon, who had hit him with a pool noodle called the Sword of Justice and narrated her own victory and declared him permanently defeated, and then sat on his chest and announced her triumph to the kingdom. He had loved her so completely in that moment, with his career in a box by the door and his entire professional future reduced to rubble, that the loving had been the loudest thing. Louder than the loss, louder than the anger, louder than the specific grinding injustice of what had been done to him. That hadn't changed. Everything else had, but that hadn't. The aircraft leveled off at altitude. The seatbelt sign chimed off. Somewhere above the Cascades, in the dark and the cold, where the air was clean and the navigation systems were doing their quiet, invisible work of keeping everything on course, Ethan Walker closed his eyes and slept without dreams for the first time in longer than he could accurately remember.